Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Tonight, I want to take you back to a different time. Not so long ago that it feels like ancient history, but long enough that the world was almost unrecognizable from the one we live in now. I want to take you back to the 1970s, to a decade when everything seemed to be changing all at once, when the country was still reeling from upheaval and transformation, when young people were seeking independence and freedom in ways their parents never had. It was a time of possibility, of open roads and new beginnings, but it was also a time when people could simply vanish without a trace. Before we begin, I want you to settle in. Lower the volume if you need to. Let the rain sounds wash over you. I know many of you are lying in bed right now, perhaps in the dark, perhaps with just the glow of your screen keeping you company. That's okay. You're safe here. These stories, while they carry weight, are told with gentleness and respect. They're told to remember, not to frighten. In the 1970s, there was no DNA database that could connect a crime scene in one state to a suspect hundreds of miles away. There were no security cameras recording every moment of every day. No cell phones that could ping locations and reveal where someone had been at any given time. There was no internet, no social media, no digital footprint that people left behind simply by existing in the modern world. If someone disappeared, the trail often went cold almost immediately. Local police departments rarely communicated with each other. There was no centralized missing persons database, no Amber Alerts, no national coordination. Just local investigations, local resources, and families left to wonder. Hitchhiking was still common, especially among young people. It was seen as adventurous, economical, a way to see the country and meet people. Young women thought nothing of sticking out their thumbs on the side of the road, trusting in the kindness of strangers. Parents worried, of course, but this was the culture of the time. Independence was prized. Freedom was everything. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about 5 young women who disappeared during this decade. 5 different states, 5 different years, 5 completely unrelated cases, as far as investigators can tell. There's no confirmed link between them, no serial killer who can be blamed for all of them, no conspiracy that ties them together. They are simply 5 lives that were cut short, 5 families that were left without answers, 5 stories that remain unfinished even now, decades later. These were real people with real lives, with families who loved them and friends who missed them. They had dreams and fears and quirks and habits that made them who they were. They were daughters and sisters and students and workers. They were young women on the cusp of their lives, standing at those transitional moments when everything seems possible, when the future stretches out ahead like an endless highway. And then they were gone. Let's begin in Vermont, in the winter of 1971. When the snow lay heavy on the ground and finals week loomed for the students at Middlebury College. The campus was beautiful in that particular way that New England campuses are beautiful in winter. All white blanketed quads and colonial brick buildings with wreaths on the doors. Students hurried between classes with their collars turned up against the cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in books and ideas, where intellectual curiosity was encouraged and young minds were shaped. Lynn Schulz was 18 years old that December, a freshman navigating her first semester away from home. She was intelligent and sensitive, the kind of student who took her studies seriously, who thought deeply about the world and her place in it. She had dark hair and a thoughtful expression in her photographs, eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond the camera's frame. Her family described her as bright, as someone who felt things intensely, who could be quiet and introspective. Like many college freshmen, she was adjusting to independence, to managing her own time and making her own decisions without the daily structure of home life. It wasn't always easy. College never is, especially that first year when everything is new and uncertain. But she was making her way, finding her footing in this new environment. Finals week was approaching, that stressful period when the semester's work all comes due at once, when library carols fill up and students survive on coffee and determination. It was December 10th, 1971, a Friday, the first day of exams for many students, though Lynn's finals were scheduled for the following week. She should have been studying, preparing, perhaps feeling that mixture of anxiety and anticipation that comes with exams. But something was on her mind. Something that would later seem strange to investigators. A comment that didn't quite make sense in context. She mentioned to someone in her dorm that she had missed the bus to New York City. Just that simple statement, offhand perhaps, or maybe weighted with meaning that only she understood. She had missed the bus to New York City. Why would she be going to New York? Finals were coming. The semester wasn't over. She hadn't mentioned any plans to leave campus. There was no family emergency, no clear reason for a trip to the city. It was just this one comment, this one small detail that would later become significant because it suggested intention, suggested planning, suggested that she had somewhere she wanted to be other than Middlebury. That afternoon, around 2:15, someone saw her near a gas station not far from campus. She was walking, moving with purpose it seemed, but walking where? Toward what? This would be the last confirmed sighting of Lynn Scholes. After 2:15 on December 10th, 1971, she simply vanished. She left everything behind. Her student ID was in her room. Her checkbook, untouched. Her belongings, her clothes, her books, all the material evidence of a life in progress, all remained in her dorm room as if she'd just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. But she never came back. She didn't show up for her exams when they began. Her absence was noted, questioned, and eventually reported. Where was Lynn? Had anyone seen her? The last sighting near the gas station became a fixed point in time, a boundary between before and after, between presence and absence. In those early days, there was confusion about what had happened. Some wondered if she had been struggling with depression, if the pressure of college had become too much, if she had chosen to leave voluntarily. Mental health wasn't discussed as openly then as it is now. The stigma was heavier. The understanding was less. But even if she had been struggling, even if she had wanted to leave, why leave everything behind? Why not take her ID, her money, the means to start over somewhere else? Others thought perhaps she had met with foul play, that something terrible had happened in that window of time between being seen near the gas station and the moment when she should have been back in her dorm. But there was no evidence. No witnesses came forward to say they'd seen anything unusual. No one reported a struggle, a scream, anything that might indicate violence. The case went cold relatively quickly. Without leads, without evidence, there wasn't much investigators could do. This was 1971. Forensic technology was limited. There were no surveillance cameras to review, no cell phone records to trace. Just a young woman who had walked out into a December afternoon and never returned. Her family never stopped looking. Her parents held on to hope for years, following every lead no matter how slim, checking every possible sighting no matter how unlikely. They aged with the weight of not knowing, with the particular burden that comes from having no closure, no body to bury, no definite answer to the question of what happened. They both passed away in the 1990s, never learning the truth about their daughter's disappearance. Lynn's sister continued the search, becoming the keeper of her memory, the one who wouldn't let the case fade into complete obscurity. Over the decades, the story of Lynn Scholes became one of those local mysteries that older residents remembered, that true crime enthusiasts occasionally discussed, but that never quite broke through to national attention. Until 2015. That year, something extraordinary happened. The case suddenly exploded into the public consciousness in a way it never had before. The Middlebury Police Department held a press conference, and the name they spoke sent shockwaves through the true crime community. Robert Durst. If you know anything about true crime, you know that name. Robert Durst, the millionaire real estate heir from New York, had been the subject of intense scrutiny for years. His wife Kathleen had disappeared in 1982. His friend Susan Berman had been murdered in 2000. His neighbor Morris Black had been killed and dismembered in 2001, though Durst was acquitted of murder in that case. He was a figure who seemed to drift through tragedy, leaving questions in his wake. In 2015, HBO aired a documentary series called The Jinx, which followed Durst and investigated the suspicious deaths and disappearances connected to him. The series was a sensation, particularly its finale, which featured Durst apparently confessing on a hot microphone in a bathroom, muttering to himself words that seemed to be an admission of guilt. But what did Robert Durst have to do with Lynn Scholes? In the 1970s, before his wife disappeared, before the later tragedies that would make him infamous, Robert Durst owned a small health food store in Middlebury, Vermont. It was called All Good Things, and it was located not far from the Middlebury College campus. He lived in the area. He was there. In 2012, police received an anonymous tip suggesting they should look into Durst in connection with Lynn's disappearance. The timing of the tip, coming 4 decades after she vanished, raises questions in itself. Who would wait so long to come forward? What prompted them to reach out after all those years? We don't know. But the tip was enough for police to reopen their investigation, to look again at the evidence, and eventually to publicly announce that they were interested in speaking with Robert Durst about the case. The media went wild. Suddenly, Lynn Schultz's name was everywhere, attached to one of the most notorious figures in American true crime. But here's what's important to understand: what often gets lost in the sensational headlines and the speculation. The police never named Robert Durst as a suspect. They said they wanted to talk to him. They said he was a person of interest. But they never publicly presented evidence linking him to Lynn's disappearance. No forensic evidence. No witness testimony placing them together. No confession. Nothing concrete. The connection was circumstantial. He was in the area. He owned a store. The timing overlapped. That was it. And in the world of criminal investigation, especially in a case this old, circumstantial presence isn't enough to build a case on. It's a starting point for questions, not an ending point for answers. Robert Durst himself never publicly addressed the Lynn Schultz case in any meaningful way. His lawyers denied any involvement. He was never charged. And in 2021, Robert Durst died in prison while serving a sentence for the murder of Susan Berman. Whatever he knew, whatever truth he may or may not have possessed about Lynn Schultz, died with him. So we're left with questions. Did Lynn encounter Robert Durst that December day? Was he involved in her disappearance? Or is this connection simply the result of proximity, of a notorious figure happening to be in the same place at the same time as an unsolved mystery, and our minds naturally trying to create patterns to find explanations where there may be none? We don't know, and perhaps we never will. What we do know is that Lynn Schultz walked out into a snowy Vermont afternoon in December of 1971, and she never came back. She never finished her freshman year. She never got to pursue whatever dreams she had for her future. She became a mystery, a question mark, a name in a cold case file. Her sister still remembers her, still hopes that someday, somehow, there will be an answer. The case remains officially open, though active investigation has long since ceased. Lynn's story is one of those that haunts a community quietly, that surfaces occasionally in local memory, that reminds us how quickly a life can slip away into uncertainty. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's honor Lynn by remembering that she was more than a mystery. She was a person. She was real. She had thoughts and feelings and a future that was stolen from her. Whatever happened that day, whoever was responsible, she deserves to be remembered as more than just a case number, more than just a name attached to speculation about a notorious killer. Take a breath. Let yourself settle deeper into your pillow. We're going to move now to another story, another young woman, another disappearance that has never been explained. This time, I want to take you to California. To Napa, to be specific, that beautiful valley known for its vineyards and rolling hills, its Mediterranean climate, and its small-town charm mixed with tourist sophistication. In 1976, Napa was smaller than it is now, quieter, still building the wine industry reputation that would eventually make it world famous. It was a place where people knew each other, where communities were tight-knit, where a young woman could feel safe walking down familiar streets. But safety, as we know, is sometimes an illusion. Eileen Hinson was 19 years old in April of 1976. She had her whole life ahead of her, and she was planning something special. She was planning for a wedding. The details here get a bit murky, conflicting even in the official records. But what seems clear is that Eileen was involved in wedding preparations. Some sources say she was going to be in a wedding party. Others say she had an appointment for a bridal fitting. The exact nature of her involvement varies depending on which account you read, but the wedding itself was real, planned, anticipated. On April 16, 1976, Eileen left her home. She was heading somewhere related to these wedding plans. Her family expected her back. She had no reason to disappear, no indication that she wanted to leave her life behind. She was a young woman with plans, with things to look forward to, with a future that seemed bright and full of possibility. But she never came home. Her suitcase was found later, left behind. Inside were her belongings, packed as if for a trip, but never taken. This detail is haunting in its own way. She had prepared to go somewhere, had folded clothes and chosen what to bring, had gone through those mundane motions of packing that we all do without thinking. And then something happened. Something that meant she never needed that suitcase, never made it to wherever she was planning to go. The circumstances of her disappearance are frustratingly vague. There's mention of a resort, of Eileen possibly being at or near a resort when she vanished. But even this detail is unclear in the sources. What resort? Where exactly? The specifics have been lost to time, or perhaps were never properly recorded to begin with. This was 1976. Police record-keeping wasn't standardized the way it is now. Different departments had different procedures. Details that seem crucial now might have seemed less important then. Or perhaps the information exists somewhere in a file box in a basement, in handwritten notes that have never been digitized, in the memories of investigators who have long since retired or passed away. What we know for certain is that Eileen Hinson disappeared on April 16, 1976, in or around Napa, California. She was 19 years old. She never made it to the wedding she was preparing for. She was never seen again. In the immediate aftermath, her disappearance was investigated as a missing person case. Police interviewed people who knew her, tried to reconstruct her movements that day, looked for any evidence of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. But the trail was cold from the start. No witnesses came forward with useful information. No evidence of foul play was found. No evidence of voluntary disappearance either. Just absence. The case faded from public attention relatively quickly. This was before the era of 24-hour news cycles, before social media could keep a case in the spotlight indefinitely. Local newspapers might run a story or two, but without new developments, without leads to pursue, the coverage dried up. Eileen's family was left to grieve and wonder in private. And then, decades later, something interesting happened. In the online true crime community, amateur investigators began to notice something. They began to compare Eileen's case to another disturbing story from California's criminal history. William Richard Bradford was a photographer and a serial killer who preyed on young women in Southern California during the late 1970s and early 1980s. He would pose as a professional photographer, promising aspiring models opportunities for work, for portfolio building, for a chance to break into the modeling industry. But his real intentions were monstrous. He used his camera to lure women to isolated locations, where he would assault and murder them. Bradford was eventually caught and convicted. In his possession, police found photographs of numerous women, many of whom have never been identified. These women were alive in the photos, posing for what they thought was a legitimate photo shoot, not knowing they were being photographed by a man who intended to kill them. Law enforcement has spent years trying to identify these women, hoping to give names to the unnamed victims, to bring closure to families who might not even know their loved ones were among Bradford's victims. One of these photographs, labeled by police as model number 40, showed a young woman with certain physical features. And some people in the online community thought they saw a resemblance to Eileen Hinson. The theory spread through forums and discussion boards. Could Eileen have been one of Bradford's victims? Could she have encountered him somehow, been lured by his photographer persona, become one of the unnamed women in his collection of horror? It's the kind of theory that gains traction easily in true crime communities. It offers an explanation, a narrative that makes sense of senseless disappearance. It provides a villain, a clear perpetrator, a way to categorize and understand what happened. But when you look closely at the evidence, the theory falls apart. The timeline doesn't quite work. Bradford's known crimes were concentrated in the late 70s and early 80s, while Eileen disappeared in April of 1976. The geographical area doesn't quite match either. Bradford operated primarily in Southern California, Los Angeles, and Orange County areas, while Eileen vanished in Northern California's Napa Valley. More importantly, when actual facial recognition experts and law enforcement looked at the comparison, they determined that the woman in model number 40's photograph was not Eileen Hinson. The physical features, when examined closely and professionally rather than through the lens of hopeful amateur investigation, didn't match. The eye shape was different. The bone structure didn't align. It wasn't her. So that theory, compelling as it might have seemed, led nowhere. Eileen's case remained unsolved, unexplained, separate from William Bradford's documented crimes. But the fact that the theory emerged at all tells us something. It tells us that people haven't forgotten Eileen, that her case still troubles people, still demands explanation, still exists in that uncomfortable space of unresolved tragedy. Decades later, people are still trying to find answers, still looking for any thread that might unravel the mystery. There's another shadow that hangs over this case, though it's never been confirmed as anything more than atmospheric coincidence. Lake Berryessa is not far from Napa, and Lake Berryessa was the site of one of the Zodiac Killer's confirmed attacks. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac Killer attacked a young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, at Lake Berryessa. Cecilia died from her injuries. Brian survived and was able to provide details about the attack, though the killer's identity was never determined despite decades of investigation and countless suspects. The Zodiac Killer has never been definitively identified, though there have been numerous suspects over the years, and the case continues to generate intense interest and investigation. The proximity of Lake Berryessa to Napa, the fact that the Zodiac operated in Northern California during this time period, has led some people to wonder if there could be any connection to Eileen's disappearance in 1976. But there's no evidence of such a connection. The Zodiac's known victims and confirmed attacks follow a specific pattern, and Eileen's disappearance doesn't fit that pattern. The Zodiac typically attacked couples in isolated areas, and he took credit for his crimes through letters to newspapers. He wanted attention, wanted people to know what he had done. Eileen's case has none of those characteristics. So the Lake Berryessa connection is really just geographical coincidence, the way true crime cases sometimes overlap in time and space without actually being related. It's the kind of thing that can seem significant when you're trying to find patterns, trying to make sense of chaos, but doesn't hold up under scrutiny. What does seem significant is that in 2012, the Napa County Sheriff's Office announced they were reviewing Eileen's case using modern forensic techniques. They didn't provide details about what evidence they were re-examining or what new approaches they were taking, but the announcement itself suggested that there was something to re-examine. That evidence existed, perhaps biological evidence that could now be tested with DNA technology that didn't exist in 1976. But no results have been made public. No arrests have been made. No new information has been released to Eileen's family or to the public. The case remains as cold as it was decades ago, just with the added frustration of knowing that somewhere there might be evidence that could provide answers, but for whatever reason, those answers aren't coming. This is one of the hardest things about cold cases from this era. The possibility that answers exist, that they're locked away in evidence storage somewhere, that the technology to find those answers has existed for years now, but the resources, the time, the investigative priority isn't there to pursue them. Cold cases pile up. New crimes demand attention. The living need protection. And cases like Eileen's, for decades old, become lower and lower priority no matter how much they deserve resolution. Eileen Hinson was 19 years old. She had been preparing for a wedding. She had packed a suitcase. She had a family who loved her and expected her home. And then she was gone, disappeared into a void of uncertainty that has never been filled. Her case is one of the most frustrating because there's so little solid information available. The details are vague, the circumstances unclear, the investigation seemingly limited even at the time. It's a disappearance swallowed by silence, by the passage of time, by the limitations of an era when missing persons weren't tracked with the urgency and coordination that we now know is so desperately necessary. Let yourself breathe. Let your muscles relax. We're going to move to another story now, another young woman, another family left waiting for answers that may never come. This time, I want to take you to Virginia Beach, to the coast, to a place where the Atlantic Ocean meets the land and the sound of waves is a constant backdrop to daily life. Virginia Beach in the 1970s was a growing city, popular with tourists in the summer, quieter in the off-season, a place where military families often settled because of the nearby naval base, where young people could find work in the service industry, in restaurants and hotels and shops that catered to the beach-going crowds. It was April again, April of 1977 this time, just a year after Eileen Hinson had disappeared in California. Spring was settling in, the weather warming, the promise of summer just around the corner. Judy Sylvester was 24 years old. She worked at a local business, showing up for her shifts reliably, earning her paycheck, living the kind of ordinary working life that most of us live. She wasn't rich or famous. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous or scandalous. She was just a young woman making her way in the world, paying her bills, getting by. She had a routine. Work, home, the small rhythms of daily existence. She rode a bicycle frequently, which was her primary means of transportation. In Virginia Beach's relatively flat terrain and mild climate, bicycling was practical, economical, a way to get around without needing a car. On April 19, 1977, Judy was scheduled to work her regular shift. Her employer expected her. Her schedule was set, but she never showed up. At first, this might not have seemed immediately alarming. People call in sick. Emergencies happen. Maybe she had a good reason for missing work and just hadn't been able to notify anyone. But as the hours passed and she remained absent, as she didn't call to explain, didn't show up to apologize, the absence began to feel more troubling. Even more concerning was the fact that she never came to pick up her paycheck. For someone who worked for a living, who needed that money to pay rent and buy groceries and manage the expenses of daily life, not picking up a paycheck is a significant red flag. It suggests that something is very wrong, that whatever happened prevented her not just from showing up to work, but from being able to access her own money, her own earnings. Judy lived in an apartment, a modest place that she called home. After her disappearance, there was confusion about her bicycle. She rode it frequently, used it regularly, but after she vanished, the bicycle was still at her apartment. Her boyfriend took it at some point after her disappearance, either to keep it safe or to use it himself, or perhaps for reasons that were never fully explained. This detail raises questions without necessarily providing answers. Did Judy leave without her bicycle that day? Did she get a ride with someone? Walk somewhere? The bicycle's presence at the apartment suggests she wasn't riding it when she disappeared, but beyond that, it tells us little. Her boyfriend's role in the case is one of those ambiguous elements that appears in so many missing person investigations. He was close to her. He had access to her apartment. He took her bicycle. But there's no public information suggesting he was ever seriously considered a suspect. No indication that police found any evidence connecting him to her disappearance. Sometimes the people closest to a missing person are just the people left behind to deal with the aftermath, to make decisions about belongings and property, to try to carry on while waiting for answers. Without more information, without details that were either never released or never uncovered, it's impossible to know what significance, if any, these details hold. What is significant and deeply troubling is something that came to light much later. In the years after Judy's disappearance, a pattern began to emerge in Virginia Beach. A pattern of murdered women. Between 1973 and 1985, at least 11 women were murdered in the Virginia Beach area. The cases seemed to share similarities. The victims were young women. They were killed in ways that suggested a level of violence and predation that pointed toward a possible serial killer operating in the area. Local television station WTKR investigated this pattern and developed a theory. They proposed that a serial killer, never identified, never caught, had been active in Virginia Beach during this time period. They called it the Virginia Beach serial killer theory, and they suggested that Judy Sylvester's disappearance might be connected to this series of murders. The victim profile seemed to fit. Judy was a young woman. She disappeared during the time frame when these other murders were occurring. She vanished without explanation, leaving no trace, which could be consistent with falling victim to a predatory killer who knew how to avoid leaving evidence. But here's the critical point. This is a theory. It's speculation based on patterns, on similarities, on the geographic and temporal clustering of crimes. It's not based on forensic evidence linking Judy's case to any of the confirmed murders. It's not based on witness testimony or confessions or physical proof. It's based on the troubling reality that many women were killed in Virginia Beach during this period, and the logical question of whether their deaths might be connected. No one has ever been charged with being the Virginia Beach serial killer because it's not clear that such a person existed in the way the theory proposes. The murders might have been committed by different perpetrators. Some of them were solved individually, linked to specific killers who had no connection to the other cases. The pattern might be an artifact of looking back and seeing connections that weren't actually there. Or the pattern might be real. There might have been a serial killer operating in Virginia Beach, someone who was never caught, never identified, someone who got away with multiple murders, and simply stopped or died or moved away before being apprehended. We don't know. And this uncertainty is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of Judy's case. Not only do we not know what happened to her, we don't even know if the theories about what might have happened have any basis in reality. Judy Sylvester was 24 years old. She was 5 feet tall, a detail that appears in her missing person description, a small detail that somehow makes her more real, more human. She wore a handmade necklace, something crafted with care, something personal and unique. These small details, these tiny pieces of who she was, are all that remain in the public record. She never picked up her paycheck. She never came home. She left behind an apartment, a bicycle, a job, a life that was interrupted midstream and never resumed. Her family waited for answers. Her friends wondered what had happened. And as the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, the months to years, the likelihood of finding her alive diminished to nothing. The case remains unsolved. Virginia Beach police have never publicly named a suspect. They've never announced a break in the case, never revealed evidence that points in any clear direction. Judy's disappearance is just one more entry in the long list of cold cases that haunt police departments across the country. One more file that gets pulled out occasionally when someone wonders if new technology or a fresh perspective might shake something loose. But that mostly sits in storage, waiting. The ocean waves in Virginia Beach continue their endless rhythm, washing up on the shore and pulling back, over and over, indifferent to human tragedy, indifferent to the questions that hang in the air like salt spray. Somewhere in that city, in those streets, on those beaches, something happened to Judy Sylvester. Someone knows, or knew, what that something was. But the secret has kept for nearly 50 years now, locked away in silence. Let's take a moment here. Let's acknowledge the weight of these stories, the heaviness of lives cut short, of families left without closure. If you're feeling that weight, that's okay. That's appropriate. These were real people. Their losses matter. But you're safe. You're in your bed, in your home, and you can honor their memory by listening, by bearing witness to their stories, even when those stories don't have satisfying endings. Breathe deeply. Let the tension flow out of your shoulders. We're going to move now to Ohio, to a college campus in the late 1970s, to a disappearance that seemed impossible because of how little distance was involved, how short the walk was, how public the area should have been. Kent State University in Ohio is a name that carries historical weight. In May of 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The Kent State shootings became a defining moment of the anti-war movement, seared into national consciousness, a tragedy that the university and the community would spend decades processing and memorializing. By 1978, 8 years had passed since those terrible events. The campus was moving forward, though the memory remained. Students attended classes, lived in dorms, participated in campus life. It was a real university, a place where young people came to learn and grow and prepare for their futures. Judy Martins was a student at Kent State in November of 1978. She was more than just a student, actually. She was a student advisor, someone who had taken on responsibility for helping other students navigate college life. This role tells us something about her character. She was someone who could be trusted with responsibility, someone organized and reliable, someone who cared about helping others. She was the kind of person who showed up when she said she would, who followed through on commitments, who took her obligations seriously. This matters because when someone like that disappears, when someone dependable and responsible simply vanishes, it creates a particular kind of alarm. It's not in character. It doesn't fit the pattern of their life. On November 26, 1978, Judy had a simple task ahead of her. She needed to walk from Dunbar Hall to Engelman Hall. If you're not familiar with the Kent State campus, these names probably don't mean much to you. But here's what you need to understand. The distance between these 2 buildings was 300 yards. 300 yards. That's less than a quarter of a mile. That's a walk of maybe 3 or 4 minutes at a normal pace. On a college campus, with other students around, with buildings and pathways and the normal activity of university life surrounding you, it should have been one of the safest, most routine walks imaginable. Judy was wearing a costume outfit that day, though the sources don't specify what kind of costume or why she was dressed that way. Perhaps it was for a campus event, a party, a theatrical production, something that made the day a little special, a little different from the ordinary routine. She left Dunbar Hall. She started walking toward Engleman Hall, 300 yards away. She never arrived. Think about that for a moment. 300 yards, on a college campus, and she simply vanished somewhere along that short walk. The immediate response when someone goes missing in a situation like this is often confusion. There must be some mistake. She must have stopped somewhere else. She must have changed her plans. Maybe she went to visit a friend. Maybe she decided to go somewhere else and forgot to tell anyone. People don't just disappear walking 300 yards across a college campus. But as the hours passed and Judy remained absent, as she didn't show up to events she was expected to attend, as she didn't return to her room, the confusion gave way to alarm. Something was wrong. Something had happened in that 300-yard walk. What makes this case even stranger is that her disappearance wasn't reported immediately. 2 days passed before Judy was officially reported missing. 2 days. In those 48 hours, people who knew her must have wondered where she was, must have noticed her absence. But for whatever reason, the formal report to police didn't happen until 2 days had elapsed. Those 2 days matter. They matter enormously. In a missing person case, especially in a potential abduction, the first hours are critical. The trail is freshest. Witnesses' memories are sharpest. Evidence hasn't had time to degrade or be destroyed. Every hour that passes makes it harder to find someone, harder to figure out what happened. By the time police were officially involved, by the time an investigation began, Judy had been missing for 48 hours. The trail was already cold. When police searched her room, they found all her possessions still there. Her belongings were undisturbed, arranged as she had left them, giving no indication that she had packed to leave or planned to go anywhere beyond that simple walk from one building to another. Everything suggested that she had intended to return, that she had expected to be back in her room soon. The search for Judy was massive. Kent State University mobilized resources. Local law enforcement brought in specialized equipment. The National Guard, the same National Guard that had been involved in the tragic shootings 8 years earlier, was called in to help search for Judy. They brought helicopters equipped with infrared technology, able to detect heat signatures from above, hoping to find any sign of her. They searched the campus grounds thoroughly. They searched the Cuyahoga River, which runs near the campus, using boats and divers to look beneath the surface. They searched fields and wooded areas, any place where someone might be hidden or might have wandered. They found nothing. No trace of Judy. No evidence of what had happened to her. No indication of where she had gone or how she had disappeared. The scale of the search demonstrates how seriously authorities took this case. Infrared helicopters aren't cheap to operate. National Guard involvement requires official authorization. River searches require trained divers and safety protocols. This wasn't a perfunctory investigation. They put real resources into finding Judy, and they came up empty. As with any missing person case involving a young woman, attention naturally turned to the people close to her. Judy had a boyfriend, though they had recently broken up. Breakups are common in college. They're painful and emotional, but they're part of the landscape of young adult relationships. Most breakups, even difficult ones, don't lead to violence or disappearance. The ex-boyfriend was questioned. He agreed to take a polygraph test, a lie detector test, to help clear himself of suspicion. He passed. Polygraphs aren't perfect, aren't admissible as definitive proof in court, but they can provide investigators with a sense of whether someone is being truthful. In this case, the polygraph suggested the ex-boyfriend was telling the truth, that he wasn't involved in Judy's disappearance. Later, tragically, this same ex-boyfriend was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. The sources don't provide details about the nature or timing of the accident, but it's mentioned in the context of the investigation, perhaps to explain why he was eventually removed from consideration as a suspect. The accident seems to have been unrelated to Judy's case, just another layer of tragedy in an already tragic story. With the boyfriend cleared, investigators had to look elsewhere. They had to consider other possibilities, other potential suspects. And this is where the case takes a dark turn into speculation and theory. William John Posey Jr. was a name that came up in connection with Judy's disappearance. Posey lived in the area, about 10 minutes from the Kent State campus. That proximity alone wouldn't be significant. Lots of people lived near the campus, but Posey wasn't just any resident. He had been linked to other deaths. The specifics of these connections aren't fully detailed in the public sources, but the implication is clear. Posey was someone with a history, someone who had been investigated in connection with other suspicious deaths of young women. When investigators working on cold cases began looking for possible links, for patterns that might connect unsolved crimes, Posey's name surfaced in relation to Judy Martin's disappearance. He lived close enough. The timing worked. His history suggested he might be capable of violence against women. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. First, being near a crime and being investigated in other cases doesn't constitute evidence of involvement in a specific crime. Second, the connection to Posey seems to have been largely circumstantial, based on proximity and history rather than on concrete evidence, placing him with Judy on the day she disappeared. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, when investigators tried to question Posey about Judy's case, he refused to comment. He was in prison at the time for other crimes, and he simply declined to discuss the case. Now, refusing to talk to police is a right that everyone has. It doesn't imply guilt. People refuse to talk to police for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes on the advice of lawyers. Sometimes because they know that anything they say, even if innocent, can be twisted or misunderstood. Sometimes simply because they don't want to cooperate with law enforcement. But when you're investigating a missing person case, when you're looking for any lead that might help find someone or at least explain what happened to them, a refusal to comment is frustrating. It leaves questions unanswered. It allows speculation to fill the void where facts should be. The truth is, we don't know if William John Posey Jr. had anything to do with Judy Martin's disappearance. There's no public evidence that definitively links him to the case. His proximity to the campus and his criminal history made him a person worth investigating, worth questioning. But that's where the connection seems to end. Without a confession, without physical evidence, without witnesses, there's nothing solid to build a case on. And this is one of the profound frustrations that Judy's family has had to live with. Her sister has been vocal over the years about feeling that police didn't take the case seriously enough from the beginning. She has suggested that because Judy was a college student, because she was a young woman, there was an initial assumption that her disappearance might have been voluntary, that she might have chosen to leave, to run away from something. This assumption, if it existed, would have been tragically misguided. Judy was a student advisor, a responsible person with obligations and commitments. She left all her belongings behind. She vanished in the middle of a 300-yard walk. Nothing about the circumstances suggested voluntary disappearance. But this pattern of initial dismissal is something that shows up again and again in missing person cases from this era, particularly cases involving young women. There was often an assumption that they had run away, that they were being dramatic, that they would turn up when they were ready. This assumption cost precious time in investigations, allowed trails to go cold, and caused immeasurable pain to families who knew their loved ones wouldn't just leave without a word. Whether this was truly a factor in Judy's case, whether police really did initially treat her disappearance as a voluntary leaving, is difficult to verify from this distance in time. But her sister's frustration is real, and it speaks to a larger pattern that many families of missing persons have experienced. Judy Martin's disappeared on November 26, 1978. She was last seen wearing a costume outfit, walking a distance of 300 yards across a college campus. She never arrived at her destination. Despite a massive search involving helicopters and the National Guard, despite an investigation that looked at multiple suspects and theories, despite decades of effort to find answers, her case remains unsolved. The Kent State campus has changed in the years since Judy disappeared. Buildings have been renovated or replaced. The student population has grown and changed. The walkway between Dunbar and Engelman Halls has been traversed by thousands of students who have no idea that someone once vanished along that route. But somewhere in the archives, in the cold case files, Judy's case remains open. Her family still waits for answers. And the question lingers like a shadow over that 300-yard stretch of campus. What happened? How could someone disappear so completely in such a short distance in such a public place? Let yourself feel the weight of this mystery, but don't let it burden you too heavily. You're here to rest, to let these stories wash over you like waves. Judy's memory deserves to be honored. Her case deserves attention, but you deserve peace. Take a deep breath. Let your body sink deeper into your mattress. We have one more case to explore tonight, one more young woman to remember. This time I want to take you to Missouri, to a small town called Scott City. If you're not from Missouri, you might not have heard of Scott City. It's a small community in the southeastern part of the state, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where local businesses are family-run and family-known, where the rhythms of life are quieter and slower than in big cities. In 1979, Scott City was even smaller than it is now. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark, where the idea of random violence seemed distant and unlikely. It was a place that felt safe. Cheryl and Scherer was 19 years old in the spring of 1979. She was working, earning money, living the kind of modest but independent life that many young people were building for themselves in small towns across America. She had a job at a gas station, working shifts that required her to be responsible for the business, to handle money and customers, and the various tasks that come with running a service station. On April 17, 1979, Cheryl was working her shift at the gas station. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary weekday, the kind of day that should have passed without incident and been forgotten among all the other ordinary days that make up a life. The gas station was located on a main road, visible from the street, not isolated or hidden. There were businesses nearby, houses within view, cars passing by. It was not a secluded location where something terrible could happen unseen. But something terrible did happen. At some point during Cheryl's shift, someone came into the gas station and took her. Or she left with someone. Or something occurred that resulted in her vanishing from her workplace in the middle of her shift. When authorities arrived and began investigating, they found several troubling details. $480 was missing from the cash register. This was 1979, so $480 was a significant amount of money, equivalent to much more in today's currency. It suggested robbery as a motive, someone coming in to steal from the gas station and taking Cheryl as well, either to prevent her from identifying them, or because the crime escalated beyond simple theft. But here's what was strange. Cheryl's purse was still at the gas station. Her car was still there, parked where she had left it when she arrived for her shift. The keys to her car were inside, available, accessible. If she had left voluntarily, if she had chosen to go somewhere, why would she leave without her purse, without her car, without the keys that would have given her transportation and freedom? Nothing about the scene suggested she had planned to leave. Everything suggested interruption, something sudden, something that happened mid-shift when she was simply doing her job. There were no witnesses who came forward to say they had seen anything unusual. No one reported seeing Cheryl leave with anyone. No one reported seeing a struggle or hearing a scream or noticing anything that seemed wrong. The gas station was on a public road, but somehow this abduction or disappearance happened without anyone seeing it, without anyone realizing what was occurring. This lack of witnesses is one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. In a small town, on a main road, during business hours, how could someone be taken without anyone noticing? It seems impossible, but it happened. The investigation began immediately. Local police recognized the severity of the situation. A young woman missing, money stolen, signs of foul play obvious. This wasn't a case that could wait or be dismissed as a voluntary disappearance. This was clearly a crime. But despite the urgency, despite the investigation, there were no immediate leads. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Cheryl had simply vanished, and the $480 had vanished with her. As the investigation continued, as days turned into weeks with no sign of Cheryl, as the local community grappled with the horror of what had happened, a name began to circulate. Actually, two names: Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. If you know anything about true crime from this era, these names might be familiar to you. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were a pair of serial killers who traveled around the country committing crimes, mostly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They killed numerous people, though the exact number has never been definitively established. What made Lucas and Toole particularly notorious, beyond their crimes themselves, was what happened after their arrest. Lucas in particular began confessing to murders all over the country. He confessed to hundreds of murders, claiming to have killed people in dozens of states, providing details about crimes that local law enforcement had been unable to solve. Police departments were eager to clear unsolved cases. They brought Lucas in, showed him files, asked him about specific murders. And Lucas confessed. Over and over, he confessed. He became known as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history based on his confessions alone. But there was a problem. A big problem. Many of Lucas's confessions were false. Investigators eventually determined that Lucas had a pattern of confessing to crimes he couldn't possibly have committed. He would study case files, memorize details, and then confess convincingly. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the infamy, the way that each new confession brought him more notoriety. He played law enforcement, taking advantage of their desperation to solve cases and close files. This doesn't mean all of his confessions were false. Lucas did kill people. His crimes were real. But the sheer number of confessions, the implausibility of the timeline, the lack of physical evidence in many cases, all suggested that he was vastly exaggerating his criminal history. Otis Toole, his sometime partner in crime, was similar. He also confessed to numerous murders, including some high-profile cases that remain controversial. Like Lucas, Toole's confessions were often unreliable, contradictory, and likely false in many instances. So when Lucas and Toole claimed to have been involved in Cheryl Scher's disappearance, when they said they had kidnapped a young woman from a gas station in the Scott City area, law enforcement had to take it seriously while also being deeply skeptical. The confession followed the pattern of many of Lucas's other confessions. He provided some details that seemed to match the case. He claimed to have been in the area at the time. He described a scenario that could potentially fit with what investigators knew about Cheryl's disappearance. But when it came to specifics, when it came to details that only the actual perpetrator would know, the confession fell apart. Lucas was shown a photograph of Cheryl and asked to identify her. He couldn't, or wouldn't. He denied recognizing her, which seems strange for someone claiming to have kidnapped her. However, there was one piece of the puzzle that couldn't be easily dismissed. Investigators were able to verify that Lucas and Toole had been in Scott City around the time of Cheryl's disappearance. This wasn't just a claim they made. There was independent evidence placing them in the area. They had been there. They could have encountered Cheryl. This is where the case becomes maddeningly ambiguous. On one hand, you have two known killers who have a history of false confessions, who claimed involvement in a crime but couldn't identify the victim. On the other hand, they were proven to be in the right place at the right time, which means they can't be ruled out entirely. Did Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole kidnap and kill Cheryl Scher? Or did they simply hear about the case, learn enough details to make a plausible confession, and add it to their collection of claimed crimes? We don't know. And frustratingly, we may never know. Lucas died in prison in 2001. Toole died in prison in 1996. Whatever truth they possessed, whatever they actually did or didn't do, went to the grave with them. But they weren't the only suspects investigated in Cheryl's case. Another name came up, another person with a violent criminal history who operated in the region. Timothy Crotcher was a serial killer who murdered numerous women in Missouri and Illinois during the 1970s and early 1980s. Crotcher was eventually caught and convicted for a series of murders. During his interrogation and prosecution, cold case investigators looked at his timeline, his known movements, the pattern of his crimes, to see if he might be connected to other unsolved cases in the area. Cheryl's disappearance was one of the cases they examined. The timing was right. The location fit within Crotcher's area of operation. The victim profile matched the type of women he targeted. But after investigation, Crotcher was ruled out as a suspect in Cheryl's case. The specifics of why he was ruled out haven't been made public, but investigators determined that he was not involved. Maybe he had an alibi for that day. Maybe the details of Cheryl's case didn't match his modus operandi. Maybe there was some piece of evidence that definitively excluded him. Whatever the reason, another potential suspect was eliminated, and the case remained unsolved. So we're left with questions. Was Cheryl killed by Lucas and Toole, two men who confessed, but whose confessions are unreliable? Was she killed by someone else entirely, some unknown perpetrator who took advantage of her being alone at the gas station? Was the $480 the motive, a simple robbery that turned deadly? Or was the money stolen to make it look like robbery when the real motive was something else entirely? The crime scene itself offers few answers. Cheryl's purse was there. Her car was there. The keys were there. The money was gone. She was gone. Beyond those basic facts, there's very little physical evidence to work with, or at least very little that has been made public. In the years since Cheryl disappeared, the community of Scott City has not forgotten her. There have been remembrance ceremonies, annual acknowledgments of the anniversary of her disappearance, efforts to keep her case in the public consciousness. Local media continues to cover her story periodically, particularly on significant anniversaries, reminding people that this case remains unsolved, that Cheryl's family still waits for answers. Her family has never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, there will be a break in the case. That someone will come forward with information. That some piece of evidence will be re-examined with new technology and yield results. That the silence surrounding Cheryl's disappearance will finally be broken. But 45 years have passed now. 45 years since that April day in 1979 when Cheryl went to work at a gas station in Scott City and never came home. 45 years of waiting, of wondering, of living with the absence of answers. Cheryl was 19 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was working, independent, making her way in the world. And then, in broad daylight, in a public place, she was taken. The violence of that taking, the audacity of it happening during business hours on a main road, speaks to either careful planning or reckless boldness on the part of whoever was responsible. Imagine the gas station now, decades later. It might still be there, or it might have been torn down and replaced with something else. The road still runs through Scott City. Cars still pass by. But that moment, that specific moment when Cheryl Scherer's life was interrupted and ended, that moment is frozen in time, preserved in police files and family memories and community grief. There's something about crimes that happen in small towns that feels particularly violating. In a big city, there's an anonymity, a sense that danger could be anywhere because you don't know everyone around you. But in a small town like Scott City, the illusion of safety is stronger. These are your neighbors. You know them. You see them at the grocery store, at church, at the gas station where you fill up your tank. When someone from your community is taken, when violence intrudes into that small town safety, it shatters something fundamental. It makes people lock doors that were never locked before. It makes parents more protective of their children. It makes young women more wary of working alone, of trusting strangers, of assuming that daylight and public space provide protection. Cheryl's case did that to Scott City. It changed the community in ways both visible and invisible, in the collective memory of trauma, in the ongoing absence of one of their own. Let's pause here and take a breath together. We've traveled through 5 stories now, 5 young women whose lives were cut short or at least interrupted in ways we cannot fully understand. Each story carries its own weight, its own particular sadness, its own unanswered questions. 5 different states: Vermont, California, Virginia, Ohio, Missouri. 5 different years spanning nearly a decade. 1971, 76, 77, 78, 79. 5 young women with different backgrounds, different circumstances, different lives. What connects them is not a killer or a conspiracy or a pattern of evidence. What connects them is the era in which they lived and disappeared. The 1970s were a time of transition in so many ways. The country was changing. Technology was beginning to advance, but hadn't yet reached the point where it could protect people or solve crimes the way it can now. There was no DNA analysis. The technology existed in laboratories, being developed by scientists, but it wasn't being used in criminal investigations yet. It would be years before DNA evidence became a standard tool for law enforcement. There were no surveillance cameras in most places. A few banks had security cameras, some government buildings. But the kind of ubiquitous video surveillance we take for granted now, where every street corner and business and doorbell has a camera recording everything, didn't exist. If something happened outside the view of human witnesses, it happened unseen and unrecorded. There were no cell phones to track locations, to show where someone had been, to provide a last point of contact. If someone left their home without telling anyone where they were going, there was no way to trace their movements electronically. The internet didn't exist for public use. There was no way to quickly share information across the country, no way to post a missing person alert that could be seen by millions of people instantly. News traveled slowly, through newspapers and television broadcasts, and only if the story was deemed newsworthy enough to report. The National Crime Information Center existed, a database where law enforcement could share information about crimes and criminals across state lines. But it was limited, not universally used, not always updated in real time. A missing person in one state might not be known about in another state, even if that information could have helped solve the case. This was the world these 5 young women disappeared into. A world where the gaps in technology and communication and forensic capability created spaces where people could simply vanish, where crimes could go unsolved not because investigators didn't care or didn't try, but because the tools to solve them didn't exist yet. But technology and forensic capability aren't the only factors that matter in these cases. There's also the question of how missing persons were treated, how seriously their disappearances were taken, especially when the missing person was a young woman. We've touched on this in some of the individual stories, but it's worth examining more directly. In the 1970s, there was often an assumption that if a young woman disappeared, particularly if she was a teenager or in her early 20s, she had probably run away. This assumption was based on outdated ideas about women and independence, about young people being flighty or irresponsible, about missing persons cases being less urgent than other types of crimes. This assumption cost lives. It delayed investigations. It meant that the critical first hours and days after someone went missing were sometimes wasted while police waited to see if the person would come back on their own. The families knew better. They knew their daughters, their sisters, their loved ones. They knew that these weren't young women who would just leave without a word, who would abandon their belongings and their responsibilities and their families without explanation. But their certainty often wasn't enough to override the institutional assumptions about runaway girls. Things have changed since then, thankfully. Amber Alerts can go out within hours of a child's disappearance. Missing person cases are taken more seriously from the start. There's greater understanding that time is critical, that every hour matters, that assumptions about voluntary disappearance can be deadly. But these changes came too late for Lynn and Eileen and Judy Sylvester and Judy Martins and Cheryl. They disappeared in an era when the response was slower, the resources were more limited, the understanding was less developed. And yet, even with all the limitations of the time, even with all the technological and institutional barriers to solving these cases, it's important to remember that people tried. Investigators worked these cases. Families never gave up. Communities remembered. The search for Judy Martins involved the National Guard and infrared helicopters. That's not a small commitment of resources. That's a serious, dedicated effort to find someone. The Middlebury Police Department reopened Lynn Schultz's case decades later, following up on a tip, pursuing any possibility of finding answers even after her parents had passed away. The Napa County Sheriff's Office reviewed Eileen Hinson's case in 2012 using modern forensic techniques, showing that cold cases aren't forgotten, that they remain open and worthy of attention even after decades have passed. These efforts matter. They may not have produced the results that everyone hoped for. They may not have brought these young women home or brought their killers to justice. But they represent something important. They represent the refusal to simply move on, to forget, to let these cases be buried by time. Every family of a missing person lives with a particular kind of torture. It's the not knowing. It's the absence of closure. It's the way hope and despair exist simultaneously. The way you can't fully grieve because you don't know for certain that your loved one is dead, but you also can't fully hope because the likelihood of them being alive diminishes with every passing day. Parents of missing children often say they feel frozen in time. They can't pack away their child's belongings because what if they come home and need them? They can't hold a funeral because there's no body to bury. They can't move on with their lives because moving on feels like abandonment, like giving up, like accepting an outcome they refuse to accept. Lynn Schultz's parents lived for more than 20 years after she disappeared, never knowing what happened to their daughter. They died in the 1990s, carrying that burden of uncertainty to their graves. Her sister continues to carry it, now the sole keeper of Lynn's memory, the one who ensures her case isn't forgotten. Cheryl Scherer's family has endured 45 years of not knowing. Think about that. 45 years of anniversaries and birthdays and holidays marked by absence. 45 years of hoping for a phone call from police saying they've finally found answers. 45 years of living with the knowledge that someone took their daughter, their sister, their loved one, and that person has never been held accountable. This is the hidden cost of unsolved cases. It's not just about justice in the abstract. It's about real people living real lives shaped by loss and uncertainty. It's about the ripple effects that spread out from a single act of violence, affecting families and friends and communities for generations. The 5 young women we've talked about tonight were all at transitional moments in their lives. Lynn was a college freshman, just beginning her higher education, exploring independence for the first time. Eileen was preparing for a wedding, participating in that celebration of new beginnings. Judy Sylvester was 24, working, establishing herself as an adult. Judy Martins was serving as a student advisor, taking on responsibility for helping others. Cheryl was 19, working at a job, earning money, building a life. These are the moments when young people are most vulnerable in some ways. They're stepping out into the world. They're taking risks, making decisions, trusting that the world will meet them with opportunity rather than danger. They're independent, but not yet fully experienced. They're confident, but not yet fully aware of all the ways that confidence can be exploited by those with bad intentions. The independence that young women sought in the 1970s was hard-won. Their mother's generation had fought for greater freedom, for the right to work outside the home, for control over their own lives and bodies. The young women of the 70s inherited that independence and pushed it further. They hitchhiked across the country. They lived alone in apartments. They took jobs that required them to work by themselves, to handle responsibility without male supervision. This was progress. This was freedom. But freedom always comes with risk, and in the 1970s, those risks were perhaps greater than they are now because the support systems and safety nets and technological safeguards we have today didn't exist. It's important not to romanticize the past or to suggest that things were better or safer then. They weren't. In many ways, the world is safer now than it was in the 1970s. Crime rates are lower. Technology provides tools for prevention and investigation that didn't exist before. Social awareness of issues like domestic violence and sexual assault has increased. But that doesn't erase the fact that these 5 young women are gone, that their families live with permanent loss, that their cases remain unsolved. Let's think for a moment about what it means for a case to remain unsolved for this long. 40, 50 years. That's multiple generations. People who were children when these women disappeared are now grandparents themselves. The world has changed completely. The 1970s might as well be ancient history to someone born in the 2000s. But for the families, time doesn't work that way. The pain doesn't diminish proportionally with the years. It changes shape, perhaps. It becomes something you learn to carry rather than something that incapacitates you. But it never goes away. It's always there, a weight that shifts but never lightens. And for the investigators who worked these cases, who spent hours and days and weeks trying to find these young women, trying to piece together what happened, there's a weight there too. Most police officers will tell you that unsolved cases haunt them. The ones they couldn't solve, the families they couldn't help, those are the cases they remember long after they've retired. Some of the original investigators on these cases have passed away now. They took their memories and insights and frustrations to their graves, just like the families did. New investigators inherit these cold cases, looking at them with fresh eyes, but also with the disadvantage of not having been there at the time, not having interviewed the original witnesses, not having that immediate knowledge that comes from working a case when it's still fresh. This is why cold cases are so difficult to solve. Evidence degrades. Witnesses die or move away or forget crucial details. The immediacy is lost. What seemed significant at the time might not have been recorded properly. What seemed insignificant at the time might have been the key to solving the case, but no one recognized it. And yet, cases do get solved. We see it periodically in the news. A case that's been cold for 20, 30, 40 years suddenly breaks. New DNA technology allows a sample to be tested that couldn't be tested before. A witness comes forward with information they were too afraid to share decades ago. A deathbed confession provides the missing piece of the puzzle. These breakthroughs give hope to families of other missing persons. They prove that cold doesn't mean hopeless. They show that persistence and new technology, and sometimes just pure luck, can bring answers even after decades of silence. Genealogical DNA has been particularly revolutionary in recent years. The ability to upload DNA from crime scenes to public genealogy databases and then trace family trees to identify suspects has solved numerous cold cases that seemed unsolvable by traditional means. The Golden State Killer case in California is the most famous example, but there have been many others. Could this technology help solve any of the 5 cases we've discussed tonight? It's possible, if there's DNA evidence from the crime scenes that has been preserved. If Cheryl Scherer's case involved any biological evidence from the gas station. if there was anything left behind that could be tested, if any of these cases had evidence that was saved and stored properly. But that's a big if. Evidence storage wasn't standardized in the 70s. Things got lost, got destroyed, got contaminated. Not every department had the resources or the knowledge to preserve evidence for future testing with technologies that didn't exist yet. Still, there's always hope. As long as these cases remain open, as long as evidence still exists somewhere, there's the possibility of answers. The question is whether those answers will come in time for the families who have been waiting for them. Lynn's parents never got answers. How many other family members have passed away while waiting? How many siblings and cousins and friends have grown old carrying the weight of these unsolved mysteries? And yet, they keep hoping. They keep advocating for their loved ones. They keep talking to journalists and cold case investigators and anyone who will listen. Because what else can they do? Giving up feels impossible. Accepting that they'll never know feels like a betrayal of the person they lost. This persistence is something to admire, even as it's heartbreaking to witness. The human capacity to hope in the face of overwhelming odds, to continue fighting even when the fight seems futile, to refuse to let a loved one be forgotten. This is both beautiful and tragic. Take a deep breath. Let your body relax. We're going to shift now to think about these cases not just individually but collectively. What do they tell us? What patterns emerge when we look at them together? The first thing that stands out is geography. 5 different states, spread across the country. Vermont in the Northeast, Virginia on the Atlantic coast, Ohio in the Midwest, Missouri in the Central States, California on the West Coast. There's no geographical cluster here, no pattern suggesting a single perpetrator traveling a specific route. This geographic spread is actually important because it helps us understand that these cases, while similar in some ways, are not connected by a serial killer. When serial killers are active, you typically see geographical patterns. They have hunting grounds, areas where they feel comfortable operating, routes they travel. The randomness of these 5 cases across such a wide swath of the country suggests 5 separate perpetrators, 5 separate crimes, 5 separate tragedies that have nothing to do with each other except their timing in the same decade. The years themselves show some clustering. 1971, then a gap until 76, then 3 consecutive years from 77 through 79. But even this pattern doesn't really tell us anything meaningful. It's likely just coincidence, just the way that random events sometimes cluster in time without there being any causal connection. What about the victims themselves? What commonalities do they share? They were all young women, ranging in age from 18 to 24. This is significant. Young women in this age range have always been, statistically, at higher risk for certain types of violent crime. They're often more trusting, less experienced in recognizing danger, more likely to be in transitional situations that create vulnerability. They were all at moments of transition in their lives. College, work, moving into adulthood, taking on new responsibilities. These transitional moments matter because they involve movement, change, disruption of routine. And disruption of routine creates opportunities for predators. When you have an established routine, when people know where you're supposed to be and when, your absence is noticed quickly. If you don't show up, alarms go off. But when you're in transition, when your schedule is irregular, when you're new to a place or a situation, your absence might not be noticed as quickly. The window of opportunity for someone with bad intentions is wider. They all left belongings behind. Lynn left her ID and checkbook. Eileen left a packed suitcase. Judy Sylvester left her purse and car. Judy Martins left all her possessions in her dorm room. Cheryl left her purse, her car, her keys. This pattern strongly suggests that none of these women intended to disappear. They weren't running away. They weren't starting new lives elsewhere. They left behind the things people need to function in the world: identification, money, transportation. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that these were not voluntary disappearances, but abductions, murders, crimes committed against women who had no intention of leaving their lives behind. They all vanished during daylight hours, or in public spaces, or in situations where they should have been safe. Lynn was seen near a gas station in the afternoon. Eileen disappeared while supposedly on her way to wedding-related events. Judy Sylvester vanished when she should have been at work. Judy Martins disappeared walking 300 yards across a college campus. Cheryl was taken from a gas station in the middle of her shift. None of these are the stereotypical scenarios we often imagine when we think about women being attacked. They weren't walking alone at night in dangerous neighborhoods. They weren't in situations that would make someone say, "Well, what did she expect?" They were doing normal things in normal places at normal times. This matters because it challenges the victim-blaming narratives that too often surround violence against women. There's a tendency to look for what the victim did wrong, what precautions they failed to take, how they put themselves at risk. But these 5 women weren't taking unusual risks. They were living their lives. They were doing what millions of other people do every day without incident. The randomness of their victimization is actually one of the most frightening aspects of these cases. If they had been engaging in risky behavior, if there were clear warning signs they ignored, if they made obvious mistakes, then we could comfort ourselves with the belief that we would be smarter, more careful, safer. But they were just living normal lives. And that means any of us, or anyone we love, could potentially face the same fate through no fault of our own. This is an uncomfortable truth. We want to believe that we have control over our safety, that if we're careful and smart and vigilant, we'll be okay. But sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time is all it takes. Sometimes, random chance puts you in the path of someone dangerous, and nothing you did or didn't do would have changed that outcome. Let's think about the investigations themselves. What do these cases tell us about how missing persons were investigated in the 1970s? In some cases, like Judy Martin's disappearance, the response was substantial. Helicopters, National Guard, river searches. This shows that when authorities recognized a case as serious from the beginning, they were willing to commit significant resources. But the 2-day delay in reporting Judy missing suggests that there wasn't always immediate recognition that someone was in danger. And we've heard from her sister that she believes police initially didn't take the case seriously enough, that there may have been assumptions about voluntary disappearance. In other cases, like Eileen Hinson's, the investigation seems to have been more limited, or at least the details of what was done aren't well documented or publicly available. This could be due to limited resources, competing priorities, or simply the fact that without leads, without evidence, there wasn't much investigators could do with the tools available to them at the time. The question of police response and investigation quality in these cases is complicated. It's easy, from our vantage point in the present, to look back and see mistakes, to wonder why certain things weren't done or weren't done sooner. But we have to remember the context. These were different times. The training was different. The resources were different. The technology was different. That doesn't excuse failures or negligence where they occurred, but it does complicate the narrative of simply blaming investigators for not solving these cases. In Cheryl Scherer's case, investigators pursued multiple suspects. They looked at Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. They considered Timothy Crotcher. They followed leads even when those leads were problematic or unreliable. That shows dedication, effort, a genuine attempt to find answers. The problem wasn't lack of effort. The problem was lack of evidence. Without witnesses, without physical evidence that could definitively link a suspect to the crime, without confessions that were reliable, there was nothing to build a case on. This is the fundamental challenge of criminal investigation. You need evidence. You need facts that can be proven in court. Suspicions aren't enough. Theories aren't enough. Circumstantial connections aren't enough. You need solid, verifiable evidence that meets the legal standards required for prosecution. And in cases this old, where the crime scene was processed with the limited technology of the 1970s, where evidence may not have been preserved properly or at all, where witnesses have died or forgotten crucial details, finding that solid evidence is incredibly difficult. Some of these cases have elements that seem promising for modern investigation. The mention of DNA testing in Eileen's case suggests there's biological evidence that could potentially be re-examined. But we don't know the results of that testing, or if it even happened, or if it yielded any useful information. The connection to Robert Durst and Lynn's case brought media attention and renewed investigation, but without concrete evidence linking him to her disappearance, it remained speculation. And now that Durst is dead, that potential avenue for answers is closed. The confessions from Lucas and Toole in Cheryl's case seemed promising at first, but their history of false confessions made those statements unreliable at best. So we're left with uncertainty. 5 cases, 5 mysteries, 5 families still waiting. Let's consider for a moment what it would mean for one of these cases to be solved. What would justice look like at this point? In most cases, the perpetrator is likely dead. If these crimes were committed in the 70s, the person responsible would be elderly now if still alive. Many perpetrators of cold cases have died before their crimes were solved, before they could be held accountable. So justice might not mean a trial. It might not mean someone going to prison. It might simply mean knowing. Knowing what happened. Knowing who was responsible. Being able to finally bury the person you lost. Literally if remains are found. Figuratively if at least the mystery is solved. For some families, that would be enough. Just knowing. Just having the uncertainty lifted. Just being able to stop wondering and start grieving properly. For other families, only a trial and conviction would feel like justice. Only seeing the person responsible held accountable, even if they're elderly and frail, even if they only spend a few years in prison before dying. The symbolic importance of that accountability, of society officially recognizing that a crime was committed and punishing the perpetrator, matters deeply. There's no right answer here. Every family is different. Every relationship with grief is unique. What one family needs for closure might be completely different from what another family needs. But what all of these families share is the desire for someone to care, for their cases not to be forgotten, for investigators to keep trying even when the odds seem impossibly long. And this brings us to the role of media and public attention in cold cases. When a case gets media coverage, when it captures public imagination, resources tend to follow. Police departments are more likely to dedicate personnel to cases that are in the spotlight. District attorneys are more likely to pursue charges when there's public pressure for justice. Lynn Schultz's case is a perfect example of this. For decades, her disappearance was a local mystery, known in Middlebury, but not widely known beyond that. Then, when the possible connection to Robert Durst emerged, suddenly her case was national news. The attention that came with that media coverage reinvigorated the investigation, brought in tips, kept the case alive in public consciousness. But media attention is fickle. It follows what's sensational, what's novel, what captures public interest. Cases that don't have that hook, that compelling narrative element, often remain obscure even though they're just as important, just as deserving of attention. Eileen Henson's case never got that kind of attention. The speculation about William Bradford gave it a brief moment in online true crime communities, but it never broke through to mainstream coverage. Judy Sylvester's case, Judy Martin's case, these are known primarily to people who specifically research missing persons cases from this era, not to the general public. Only Cheryl Scherer's case seems to have maintained relatively consistent local media coverage, with anniversary stories and remembrance ceremonies keeping her memory alive in her community. But even that coverage is limited to the local area, to people who have some connection to Scott City or southeastern Missouri. This disparity in media coverage isn't fair, but it's reality. And it has real consequences for investigations, for the resources that get dedicated to solving cases, for the likelihood that new tips or witnesses will come forward. The rise of true crime as a genre, both in podcasts and documentaries and online communities, has actually helped some cold cases. When podcasters or documentary filmmakers take an interest in a case, they often uncover new information, generate new tips, put pressure on law enforcement to re-examine evidence. The Serial podcast famously led to Adnan Syed's conviction being overturned. The documentary series The Jinx led to Robert Durst's arrest for Susan Behrman's murder. But true crime coverage can also be exploitative, sensational, more interested in entertainment than in actually helping solve cases or bring comfort to families. The line between respectful coverage that serves the interests of victims and their families and exploitative coverage that treats real tragedies as entertainment is not always clear. That's why tonight, in telling these stories, the goal has been to remember these young women as people first. Not as mysteries to be solved or puzzles to be dissected, but as real human beings who lived real lives, who had families who loved them, who deserved better than what happened to them. Let's think about the communities where these disappearances occurred. How did these crimes change those communities? In small towns like Scott City, a crime like Cheryl's disappearance reverberates for generations. Everyone knew about it. Everyone knew someone who knew Cheryl or her family. The gas station where she worked became a landmark of tragedy, a place people drove past and remembered what happened there. Small towns have long memories. The older residents remember when it happened. They tell younger residents about it. It becomes part of the town's history, part of its collective memory and identity. Not in a positive way, but in a way that can't be erased or forgotten. On college campuses like Middlebury and Kent State, student populations turn over every 4 years. The students who were there when Lynn disappeared or when Judy Martins vanished have long since graduated, moved on, aged into their 60s and 70s. Current students might not even know about these cases unless they happen to research campus history or take an interest in true crime. But for the faculty and staff who were there at the time, for the townspeople who live near these campuses, the memories remain. The buildings where these young women lived are still there. Students still walk the path that Judy Martins walked between Dunbar and Engelman Halls, almost certainly unaware of the tragedy that occurred there. There's something poignant about that. Life goes on. New students arrive every fall, excited and nervous about starting college, just like Lynn was in 1971. They have no idea that decades ago, another freshman disappeared and was never found. They walk through their daily lives on campuses where tragedy struck, and they don't feel the weight of that history. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should there be plaques or memorials, constant reminders of what happened? Or is it okay for life to move forward, for the daily business of education to continue without the shadow of unsolved tragedy hanging over everything? There's no easy answer. Remembering is important. These young women deserve to be remembered. Their cases deserve attention. But constant commemoration of tragedy can also be overwhelming, can make it hard for communities to heal and move forward. Most of these cases have found some middle ground. There are occasional remembrances, anniversary stories in local papers, families who keep the memory alive. But there isn't constant, daily attention. The communities have learned to live with the weight of these unsolved mysteries without being crushed by them. And perhaps that's the best we can hope for. That these cases aren't forgotten, but that they also don't consume the communities where they occurred. That there's space for both remembrance and for moving forward. Let's talk about the families themselves for a moment. What is it like to be the sibling, the parent, the loved one of someone who disappeared and was never found? We've mentioned Lynn's sister, who has carried on the search for answers after her parents died. Imagine being in that position. Your sister disappeared when you were young. Your parents spent the rest of their lives looking for her, hoping for answers, and died without ever getting those answers. Now you're the only one left who remembers her firsthand, who knew her as a sister, not just as a case file or a name in a news story. That's an enormous burden to carry. You become the keeper of memory, the advocate, the voice for someone who can no longer speak for themselves. You feel obligated to keep searching, to keep the case alive, because if you don't, who will? If you give up, if you stop pushing for answers, does that mean your sister is truly gone, truly forgotten? This sense of obligation is common among family members of missing persons. They feel they owe it to their loved one to never stop looking, never stop hoping, never accept the uncertainty as final. It's a form of loyalty, of love, but it's also exhausting and sometimes consuming. Some family members find ways to channel their grief and their advocacy into productive action. They work with other families of missing persons. They advocate for policy changes, for better missing persons databases, for more resources for cold case investigations. They turn their personal tragedy into a force for change that might help other families. Others find that the weight becomes too much, that they need to step back for their own mental health and well-being. And there's no shame in that. Grief is not a contest. No one should be judged for how they cope with the loss of a loved one, especially a loss as ambiguous and ongoing as having someone disappear without answers. The siblings and children of missing persons often talk about how their whole lives have been shaped by this absence. They grew up in the shadow of their missing family member. Their parents were preoccupied with searching, with grieving, with the ongoing trauma of not knowing. Family gatherings were marked by absence, by the empty chair at the table, by the conversations that carefully avoided or directly addressed the person who wasn't there. Some of these family members have gone on to have their own children, who have grown up knowing about their aunt or cousin who disappeared, who have been raised with this family history of loss and mystery. The trauma echoes across generations, affecting people who weren't even born when the disappearance occurred. This is the ripple effect of violent crime. It's not just the direct victim who suffers. It's their family, their friends, their community. And when the crime is never solved, when there's never closure or justice, those ripples continue indefinitely. Let's take a moment to breathe together, to acknowledge the heaviness of these stories without letting that heaviness overwhelm you. You're safe in your bed. These are stories from the past, important stories that deserve to be told and heard. But they're not happening now, not in this moment. You can hold space for these young women and their families while also taking care of yourself. When we think about changes that have occurred since the 1970s, changes that might prevent similar cases today, or at least make them more solvable, what comes to mind? The most obvious is technology. DNA analysis has revolutionized criminal investigation. Surveillance cameras are everywhere. Cell phones track our movements. Digital footprints reveal where we've been, who we've communicated with, what we've searched for online. These technological advances create a world that would be almost unrecognizable to someone from the 1970s. If Lynn Schulz disappeared today, investigators would immediately pull cell phone records to see where she had been, who she had called, when her phone last pinged a tower. They would review surveillance footage from cameras around campus, from the gas station where she was last seen, from nearby businesses and traffic cameras. If Judy Martins disappeared walking 300 yards across campus today, there would almost certainly be video footage of at least part of that walk. Security cameras would have captured her leaving one building, perhaps walking along the pathway, potentially even the moment when something went wrong. If Cheryl Scherer was taken from a gas station today, the station would have multiple cameras recording everything. The perpetrator would likely be caught on video. Their vehicle would be recorded, license plate visible. Even if they wore a mask or disguised their appearance, the footage would provide leads, evidence, a starting point for investigation. This technological surveillance has drawbacks, certainly. Privacy concerns are real and valid. The idea of being constantly watched and recorded troubles many people, and rightfully so. But in the context of solving violent crimes, of finding missing persons, of holding perpetrators accountable, these technologies have been invaluable. The National Crime Information Center has been expanded and improved. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, was created to provide a centralized database where families can report missing persons and law enforcement can share information across jurisdictions. This seems like such an obvious necessity that it's shocking it didn't exist until 2007. Before NAMUS, there was no comprehensive national database. If someone went missing in Vermont and turned up dead in California, those two jurisdictions might never make the connection. Now, there's at least a system in place to try to bridge those gaps, to ensure that information is shared, that patterns are recognized. Amber Alerts have changed the response to missing children and young people. When someone goes missing now, particularly if foul play is suspected, alerts can go out within hours to every cell phone in the area. The public becomes eyes and ears for law enforcement. Millions of people are immediately aware and watching. This kind of immediate, widespread notification simply wasn't possible in the 70s. News traveled through newspapers and television broadcasts, and only if the story was deemed newsworthy enough. A missing college student might get a mention in the local paper, but that's where the information stopped. People in the next town over might never hear about it. Cultural changes matter too. There's greater awareness now of the warning signs of abusive relationships, of predatory behavior, of the tactics that traffickers and abusers use to isolate and control victims. There's more education about personal safety, about trusting your instincts, about the importance of telling people where you're going and when you'll be back. Hitchhiking, once common and accepted, is now widely recognized as dangerous. Young people today are taught not to accept rides from strangers, not to get into cars with people they don't know well. This is both good and limiting. Good because it reduces a significant risk factor. Limiting because it reflects a loss of the kind of open, trusting culture that made hitchhiking possible in the first place. Law enforcement training has improved. There's better understanding of how to investigate missing persons cases, how to recognize the signs that distinguish voluntary disappearance from foul play, how to preserve evidence for future testing with technologies that might not exist yet. The formation of cold case units in many police departments has meant that old cases get revisited periodically, that new techniques are applied to old evidence, that cases don't just sit in storage gathering dust, but are actively worked even decades after they went cold. All of these changes are positive. They represent progress, learning from past failures, building systems and protocols that better protect people and better solve crimes. But we have to be careful not to become complacent, not to assume that because we have better technology and better systems, these kinds of tragedies can't happen anymore. People still go missing. Young women still disappear. Crimes still go unsolved. The tools are better now, but they're not perfect. Surveillance cameras can malfunction or be disabled. Cell phones can be turned off or destroyed. Perpetrators can be careful, can avoid leaving evidence, can exploit the gaps that still exist in our systems. And there are new challenges that didn't exist in the 70s. Human trafficking networks that use sophisticated methods to hide their victims. Online predators who can groom targets from behind screens. The dark web and encrypted communications that make it harder for law enforcement to track criminal activity. So while we should acknowledge and celebrate the progress that's been made, we should also remain vigilant. Continue improving our systems. Continue working to protect vulnerable people and solve crimes when protection fails. For the families of these 5 young women, all of this progress came too late. Their loved ones disappeared in an era when the tools to find them or to solve their cases didn't exist. And now, even with all our modern technology, the cases remain cold because the critical evidence was never collected or wasn't preserved properly or never existed in a form that modern technology can analyze. This must be particularly galling for these families. To watch as other cold cases get solved through DNA analysis or genealogical research. To see the amazing successes that modern forensic science has achieved. And to know that your case still sits unsolved because of limitations that can't be overcome retroactively. You can't go back in time and install security cameras in 1971. You can't collect evidence that was never collected in the first place. You can't interview witnesses who are now dead. Some opportunities, once missed, can never be recovered. And yet, even knowing this, the families hope. Because sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes a witness who stayed silent for decades decides to come forward. Sometimes a piece of evidence that seemed insignificant at the time turns out to be the key to everything. Sometimes luck and persistence and new technology align in just the right way to break a case open. It's this hope that keeps families going. That keeps cold case investigators working on cases that seem hopeless, that keeps these stories alive in public memory. The 5 young women we've talked about tonight deserve that hope. They deserve to have their cases worked, their memories honored, their families supported. They deserve justice, even if that justice comes decades late, even if the person responsible is long dead, even if all that's achieved is finally knowing the truth. Lynn Schulz deserves to be remembered as more than a possible Robert Durst victim. She was a person, a student, a daughter, a sister. She had thoughts and dreams and fears that were uniquely hers. She existed beyond the mystery of her disappearance. Eileen Hinson deserves to be remembered as more than a grainy photograph that might or might not match a serial killer's victim. She was preparing for a wedding. She had packed a suitcase. She had plans. She was looking forward to something. Judy Sylvester deserves to be remembered as more than a statistic in a theory about a Virginia Beach serial killer. She was 5 feet tall and wore a handmade necklace. She rode a bicycle. She showed up for work. She was real. Judy Martins deserves to be remembered as more than the girl who disappeared walking 300 yards. She was a student advisor, someone trusted with responsibility, someone who helped others. She had been through a breakup and was moving forward with her life. Cheryl and Scherer deserves to be remembered as more than a gas station disappearance, more than a name in Henry Lee Lucas's questionable confessions. She was 19 years old, working to support herself, living independently. She was building a life. These were whole people with whole lives. Yes, their disappearances are mysteries that deserve to be solved. But more importantly, they were human beings who deserved to live long lives, who deserved safety and opportunity and the chance to grow old and accomplish their dreams. Their deaths or disappearances or whatever fate befell them were tragedies. Not just puzzles to be solved, not just case files to be studied, but real losses that created real grief that continues to this day. Let yourself breathe. Feel the weight of your body against your mattress. Notice how your breath moves in and out, steady and calm. These stories are heavy, but you're holding them with care, with respect, and that matters. There's something profound about sitting with unsolved mysteries like these. In our modern world, we're accustomed to answers. We can look up almost anything on our phones within seconds. We expect resolution, closure, neat endings to stories. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes there are no answers. Sometimes mysteries remain mysteries, and we have to find a way to live with that uncertainty. This is what the families of missing persons grapple with every day. The human mind craves closure. We want to know what happened, even when the truth is painful. Uncertainty is, in many ways, harder to bear than painful certainty. At least with certainty, you can grieve, you can process, you can eventually begin to heal. But uncertainty keeps you suspended in a state of not knowing, unable to fully grieve because there's still that whisper of hope, unable to fully hope because the likelihood of a good outcome diminishes with every passing day. Psychologists call this ambiguous loss, and it's recognized as one of the most difficult forms of loss to process. When someone dies, there are rituals. There's a funeral. There's a burial or cremation. There are condolence cards and casseroles, and people gathering to support each other. There's a social framework for grief, a roadmap that helps guide people through the process. But when someone disappears, there's none of that. There's no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no formal acknowledgement of death because death hasn't been confirmed. You're in limbo, frozen between hope and despair, unable to move forward, but unable to go back to the way things were before. The families of these 5 young women have lived in this limbo for decades. Some of them, like Lynn's parents, lived in it until they died. They never got release from that uncertainty. They carried it to their graves. Think about what that means. Lynn Schultz's parents spent more than 20 years waiting for answers. 20 years of birthdays and Christmases marked by absence. 20 years of hoping that the phone would ring with news. 20 years of seeing young women who looked like Lynn from behind and feeling their hearts leap before reality crashed back in. 20 years of going to bed every night not knowing what happened to their daughter. And then they died without ever knowing. The uncertainty they carried through their entire adult lives remained unresolved when they took their last breaths. Their daughter's case outlived them, continuing on while they passed into death still not knowing. This is one of the cruelest aspects of cold cases. Time favors the perpetrator, not the victim's family. With each passing year, the likelihood of solving the case decreases. Evidence degrades. Witnesses die. Memories fade. The perpetrator might die too, taking their secrets to the grave. And the family is left with nothing but questions that will never be answered. But even knowing this, even understanding that the odds are against them, families continue to hope and fight and advocate. Because what's the alternative? Giving up feels impossible. Accepting that you'll never know feels like abandoning your loved one. So you keep going, keep pushing, keep hoping that somehow, against all odds, there will be a breakthrough. This persistence is admirable, but it's also exhausting. It takes a toll on mental health, on relationships, on the ability to live a normal life. Some family members find themselves consumed by the search, unable to focus on anything else, their entire existence revolving around this one unsolved mystery. Others find ways to compartmentalize, to create space in their lives for other things, while still maintaining hope for resolution. They build careers, raise families, pursue hobbies, live their lives while carrying the weight of loss and uncertainty. It's a delicate balance, and different people manage it in different ways. There's no right way to grieve someone who's missing. There's no timeline, no expected progression through stages, no point at which you're supposed to be over it. The grief just is, persistent and ongoing, sometimes in the foreground and sometimes in the background, but always present. And society doesn't always understand this kind of grief. People know how to respond to death. They send flowers and cards. They say, "I'm sorry for your loss." They acknowledge the grief and give it space. But when someone is missing, the social response is less clear. Do you offer condolences? Do you maintain hope? Do you bring up the missing person or avoid the subject to spare the family pain? This awkwardness can lead to isolation for families of missing persons. People don't know what to say, so they say nothing. They avoid the family because they don't want to cause pain or because they feel uncomfortable with the ambiguity. And the family ends up dealing with their grief largely alone, without the community support that would be offered if there had been a confirmed death. Some families have found community with other families of missing persons. Support groups exist, both in person and online, where people who understand this particular kind of grief can connect and support each other. These connections can be lifelines, providing validation and understanding that's hard to find elsewhere. But even within these communities, each case is unique. Each family's experience is their own. The specifics of how their loved one disappeared, the evidence that exists or doesn't exist, the level of law enforcement engagement, the media attention or lack thereof, all of these factors create different experiences even within the shared experience of having a missing loved one. Let's pause for a moment and consider the perpetrators of these crimes. We don't know who they were. We don't know their motivations. We don't know if they're still alive or if they took their secrets to the grave. But they were someone. They had lives, families, maybe careers. They existed in communities, interacted with people, presented themselves as normal. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of unsolved violent crimes. The person responsible is out there somewhere, or was. They might have lived long lives. They might have had children and grandchildren who have no idea what they did. They might have been well-liked in their communities, considered good neighbors, or reliable co-workers. Or they might have shown signs, might have had other incidents in their past, might have been known to be troubling or dangerous, but never caught for this particular crime. We don't know. Without knowing who they were, we can't know anything about them. But we can know this: they took something precious. They destroyed families. They created decades of grief and uncertainty. And they got away with it, at least so far. They avoided accountability, avoided punishment, avoided having to face what they did. This is its own kind of injustice. Not just the crime itself, but the escape from consequences. The ability to move on with their lives while their victims' families remained frozen in grief. Some people wonder if these perpetrators felt guilt, if they were haunted by what they did, if they lay awake at night thinking about the lives they destroyed. It's comforting to imagine that they suffered some kind of internal punishment, even if external justice never came. But the truth is, we don't know. Some violent offenders do feel remorse. Others don't. Some are haunted by their crimes. Others compartmentalize and move on. There's a desire to believe that evildoers suffer for their evil, that karma or guilt or some kind of cosmic justice ensures they pay a price even if human justice fails. But that's more about our need for the world to make sense than about reality. Sometimes bad people get away with terrible things and live comfortable lives. Sometimes there is no cosmic balance, no inevitable punishment. Sometimes injustice just is. This is hard to accept. We want to believe in justice, in fairness, in the idea that good is rewarded and evil is punished. But the existence of these unsolved cases, of families who wait decades without answers, challenges that belief. It forces us to confront the possibility that justice is not inevitable, that bad things happen to good people, and the people responsible sometimes face no consequences. And yet, even knowing this, we continue to pursue justice. We continue to investigate cold cases, to develop new forensic technologies, to build databases and systems meant to catch perpetrators and solve crimes. Because even if justice isn't inevitable, it's still worth pursuing. Even if we can't solve every case, each case we do solve matters enormously to the family involved. The families of these 5 young women are still waiting for their cases to be the ones that get solved. They're still hoping that their loved ones will be the ones who finally get justice, even if that justice comes decades late. And who's to say it won't happen? Cold cases get solved all the time now. Cases that seemed hopeless 30, 40, 50 years ago are being cracked open through genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis and fresh investigative approaches. The Golden State Killer evaded capture for decades. His crimes spanned years and terrorized California. He seemed uncatchable, a ghost who could commit horrific crimes and disappear without a trace. And then, in 2018, he was finally identified and arrested through genetic genealogy. Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, had been living a quiet life in suburban Sacramento while the families of his victims waited for justice. His arrest came 40 years after his last known crime. 40 years. Many of his victims' family members had died waiting for answers. But some lived to see him caught, lived to see him prosecuted, lived to see him stand in court and face accountability for what he had done. If that case could be solved after 40 years, why not these? Why not Lynn Schultz's case, or Eileen Hinson's, or any of the others? The science exists. The databases exist. The investigative techniques have been developed and refined. What's needed is the right piece of evidence, the right sample of DNA, the right witness finally deciding to come forward, the right convergence of circumstances that cracks the case open. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen next year. It could happen 20 years from now when some new technology is developed that can do things we can't even imagine yet. Or it might never happen. The uncertainty cuts both ways. There's always hope, but there's also the very real possibility that these cases will remain unsolved forever. This is what the families live with. This dual reality of hope and despair, possibility and probability, the chance of answers existing alongside the likelihood that answers will never come. Let's think about what these cases meant to the communities where they occurred at the time they happened. We've touched on this before, but it's worth exploring more deeply. In Middlebury, Vermont, in December of 1971, the disappearance of a college student was shocking. This was a small, safe college town. These things didn't happen there. The campus community was tight-knit, protective of its students. When Lynn vanished, it shattered that sense of safety. Parents of other students worried. Should they pull their children out of school? Was the campus safe? College administrators had to balance being honest about the situation with not creating panic, not damaging the institution's reputation. It was a delicate line to walk. Students became more cautious. The freedom and independence they had enjoyed suddenly felt dangerous. Young women started traveling in groups, started being more careful about where they went and when. The campus atmosphere changed, became more anxious, more watchful. And when the case went unsolved, when weeks turned to months with no answers, that anxiety didn't fully dissipate. It settled into a kind of background unease, a awareness that something terrible had happened and no one knew why or how or who was responsible. In Napa, California, the reaction to Eileen Hinson's disappearance was likely similar, though with less public documentation. A young woman preparing for a wedding, vanishing without explanation, leaving a packed suitcase behind. It's the kind of story that makes people lock their doors, that makes parents hold their daughters a little tighter. Virginia Beach in 1977 was already dealing with anxiety about the murdered women who had been found in the area. Judy Sylvester's disappearance added to that fear. Was there a serial killer operating in Virginia Beach? Were young women particularly at risk? The uncertainty was terrifying. When you don't know who's responsible for crimes, when there's no clear pattern or explanation, everyone becomes a suspect in the collective imagination. Your neighbor could be a killer. The friendly guy at the gas station could be dangerous. That nice man who offered to help could have ulterior motives. Trust erodes. Community cohesion weakens. At Kent State University, Judy Martin's disappearance was particularly troubling because of how impossible it seemed. 300 yards across campus and she vanished. If that could happen, what did it mean for every other student who walked across campus every day? The scale of the search, with National Guard helicopters and river searches, demonstrated how seriously the disappearance was taken, but it also heightened the fear. If authorities were deploying those kinds of resources, the situation must be truly dire. And in Scott City, Missouri, Cheryl Scherer's abduction from the gas station was perhaps the most frightening scenario of all. Taken in broad daylight from her workplace, with money stolen but her car and belongings left behind. It suggested a level of brazenness, of not caring about being seen or caught, that was deeply unsettling. Small-town Scott City had to confront the reality that their community wasn't as safe as they had believed. Someone among them, or passing through their town, was capable of this violence. And no one knew who. These community impacts matter. They're part of the ripple effect of violent crime, the way fear and anxiety spread outward from the central tragedy, affecting people who didn't know the victim personally, but feel the collective threat. And these impacts can last for generations. Even now, decades later, these crimes are part of the history of these communities. They're stories that get told, warnings that get passed down, reminders that terrible things can happen anywhere. There's a certain kind of loss of innocence that occurs when violent crime touches a community that thought itself safe. The world becomes a little darker, a little more dangerous. Trust becomes harder to give, and that change is permanent in some ways. Even if the perpetrator is eventually caught, even if justice is served, the community can never quite return to that earlier innocence. This is particularly true for the young people who were the same age as these victims when they disappeared. The college students at Middlebury who were freshmen like Lynn, who saw themselves in her, who understood that what happened to her could have happened to any of them. The young women in Virginia Beach who worked service jobs like Judy Sylvester, who realized their own vulnerability. The Kent State students who walked across campus every day, now hyper-aware that Judy Martins had disappeared doing the same thing. For these peers, the disappearances were personal in a way they weren't for older community members. These weren't abstract victims. These were people who could have been friends, classmates, co-workers, people whose lives looked like their own lives. Some of these peers became advocates for missing persons, for better safety measures on campuses, for more resources for investigations. They channeled their fear and grief into action, trying to create change that might prevent similar tragedies. Others withdrew, became more cautious, limited their lives out of fear. They stopped hitchhiking, stopped going places alone, stopped trusting as easily. They protected themselves, but at the cost of some of the freedom and independence they had been claiming. And still others tried to move on, tried not to let fear control their lives, tried to maintain the belief that they could be safe if they were just careful enough. This response too had costs, the constant low-level anxiety of trying to be vigilant while also trying to live normally. There's no perfect response to this kind of community trauma. Everyone copes differently. Everyone finds their own way to integrate the knowledge that terrible things can happen, that safety is not guaranteed, that people they know can suddenly disappear. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. We're going to shift our focus now to think about what we owe to these 5 young women and others like them whose cases remain unsolved. First and foremost, we owe them remembrance. Not just as cases, not just as mysteries, but as people, as individuals who lived, who had personalities and quirks and dreams and fears, who laughed and cried and hoped and worried, who were loved and who loved others. It's easy for unsolved cases to become dehumanized, reduced to facts and theories and speculation. But behind every case is a person who lived, who mattered, whose absence created a hole that can never be filled. We owe them the effort to keep their cases active, to continue investigating even when the odds seem long. Cold case units exist because we as a society have decided that unsolved crimes still matter, that victims still deserve justice even decades after they were victimized. This is good and right, and it should continue. We owe them honesty in how we discuss their cases. Not wild speculation, not unfounded accusations, not sensational theories that prioritize entertainment over truth, but honest, careful examination of facts, respectful consideration of possibilities, acknowledgement when we simply don't know. We owe their families support and compassion. The families of missing persons often feel forgotten, feel that the world has moved on while they remain stuck in their grief. Recognition of their ongoing pain, willingness to listen to their stories, respect for their experience, these things matter. We owe ourselves the awareness that these cases represent. The understanding that violent crime happens, that people we love can be taken from us suddenly and without warning, that justice is not inevitable. This awareness shouldn't paralyze us with fear, but it should make us vigilant, make us take reasonable precautions, make us value the safety and security we have. And perhaps most importantly, we owe it to these victims and their families to continue working toward a society where such tragedies are less likely, where the systems to prevent violence and solve crimes when prevention fails are as robust as possible. This means supporting law enforcement in their efforts while also holding them accountable when they fail. It means funding forensic laboratories and cold case units. It means maintaining and improving databases like NAMAS. It means teaching young people about safety without teaching them to live in fear. It means creating a culture where violence against women is not tolerated, where the early warning signs of dangerous behavior are recognized and addressed, where victims and potential victims are believed and supported. These are big, systemic changes that require sustained effort from many people over long periods of time. But they matter. Each improvement in our systems, each case that gets solved that wouldn't have been solved before, each person who is kept safe because of better prevention or intervention, these represent progress. The 5 young women whose stories we've explored tonight didn't get the benefit of our improved systems. They disappeared in an era when the tools and knowledge we have now didn't exist. But their cases, their memories, their families' ongoing advocacy, these have contributed to the changes that have been made. Every time a family speaks out about their missing loved one, they raise awareness. Every time media covers a cold case, It reminds the public and law enforcement that these cases matter. Every time someone advocates for better resources or better policies, they create the possibility of change that might help the next family. This is cold comfort for families who are still waiting for their own answers, still hoping for their own justice. No amount of systemic improvement brings back the person they lost or solves the mystery that haunts them. But it does give meaning to their suffering, makes their advocacy matter beyond their individual case. Lynn Schultz's sister, continuing to speak about Lynn's case even after her parents died, helps keep missing persons issues in public consciousness. Cheryl Scherer's family, participating in remembrance ceremonies year after year, ensures that her case isn't forgotten, that investigators are reminded periodically that this unsolved crime still matters. These acts of remembrance and advocacy require enormous strength and courage. It would be understandable for families to retreat into private grief, to stop engaging with media and law enforcement, to try to protect themselves from the ongoing pain of having their loved one's disappearance be a subject of public discussion. But many families choose to stay engaged, to keep fighting, to keep their loved ones' names and faces and stories in the public eye. They do this partly for themselves, because it gives them a sense of agency, a way to actively work toward the answers they need. But they also do it for others, hoping that their advocacy might prevent another family from experiencing the same nightmare. There's a particular generosity in this, a willingness to use personal tragedy to try to help strangers, to work toward preventing future victims even while still dealing with the aftermath of past victimization. Think about the strength that requires to be in active, ongoing grief while also trying to create systemic change. To tell your story over and over to journalists and investigators and advocates, reliving the trauma each time, in hopes that this retelling might lead to a breakthrough or might help someone else. Not everyone has the strength, and that's okay. There's no obligation for victims' families to become advocates or public figures. Grief is personal, and everyone has the right to process it in whatever way works for them, whether that's public advocacy or private mourning or something in between. But for those families who do choose to engage publicly, who do choose to keep fighting and advocating and remembering, we owe them our attention and respect. When they speak, we should listen. When they ask for help, we should provide it if we can. When they advocate for change, we should support them. These families have lived through something most of us can barely imagine. They have expertise born of experience, knowledge about what works and what doesn't in missing persons investigations, insights into how systems fail and how they could be improved. Their voices should be central to discussions about missing persons policy and practice. Let yourself settle deeper into rest. Feel your breathing slow and deepen. We're moving through these stories together, honoring these lives, holding space for the grief and the mystery without letting it overwhelm us. In thinking about these 5 cases collectively, about what they represent and what they teach us, one theme that emerges is the importance of taking missing persons cases seriously from the very beginning. We've seen hints in several of these cases that initial responses may have been delayed or dismissive. The 2-day delay in reporting Judy Martin's missing. The suggestions from Judy Martin's sister that police initially didn't take the case seriously. The general cultural assumption in the 70s that young women who disappeared had probably run away. These delays and dismissals cost precious time. In the critical first hours after someone goes missing, evidence is fresh, memories are sharp, the trail is warmest. Every hour that passes makes the case harder to solve. Every delay in mobilizing resources reduces the chances of a positive outcome. We've learned this lesson as a society. We know now that the first hours matter enormously. We know that assumptions about voluntary disappearance can be deadly. We know that taking reports seriously and acting quickly saves lives. But this knowledge came at a cost. It came from cases like these, from tragedies that might have had different outcomes if the response had been different, if resources had been mobilized faster, if the cases had been taken seriously from the start. This is how progress often works, unfortunately. We learn from failures. We identify what went wrong and work to ensure it doesn't happen the same way again. But that doesn't undo the original tragedy. It doesn't bring back the people who were lost while we were still learning. Another theme that emerges is the danger of isolated investigations. 5 different cases in 5 different states, investigated by 5 different police departments with no coordination or communication between them. At the time, This was normal. This was how law enforcement operated. Local crimes were investigated locally. But what if there had been connections between these cases that could have been identified if information had been shared? What if witness descriptions from one case could have provided leads in another? What if a suspect investigated in one jurisdiction had connections to another jurisdiction? We'll never know, because the information wasn't shared. Each investigation proceeded in isolation, using only local resources and local knowledge. Today, things are better in this regard. Federal databases exist. Multi-jurisdictional task forces can be formed when patterns suggest connected crimes. But we're still not perfect. Information sharing still isn't as seamless as it should be. Jurisdictional boundaries still create barriers. Resources still vary wildly from one department to another. There's more work to be done, more systems to build and improve, more training to provide, more resources to allocate. The work of creating a justice system that truly serves victims and their families is ongoing. But we can see the progress that has been made. We can see how much better equipped we are now to prevent these tragedies and to solve them when prevention fails. And we can commit to continuing that progress, to not becoming complacent, to always working toward better protection and better justice. For Lynn and Eileen, and both Judas and Cheryl, this progress came too late. But their cases, their stories, the advocacy of their families have contributed to that progress. Their losses were not meaningless, even though they were tragic. Something has been learned. Change has been made. Future victims have been helped by the lessons drawn from these past tragedies. This doesn't make the tragedies okay. It doesn't justify the losses or comfort the families who are still waiting for answers. But it does provide some small measure of meaning, some sense that these lives mattered, that their stories have made a difference. Let's return to the individual women for a moment, to remember them not as a collective case study, but as 5 unique individuals. Lynn Scholes was 18 years old, intelligent and sensitive, navigating her first semester of college. She mentioned missing a bus to New York City, a detail that still puzzles people decades later. What did she mean? Where was she planning to go? We may never know. But that small detail tells us she had thoughts and plans, things she was thinking about beyond her immediate college responsibilities. She was a full person with a full interior life. Eileen Henson was 19, involved in wedding preparations, packing a suitcase for a trip she never took. She was at an age when weddings are exciting, when celebrating love and new beginnings feels joyful and full of promise. She should have attended that wedding. She should have worn whatever outfit she had packed in that suitcase. She should have danced and laughed and celebrated with others. Judy Sylvester was 24, 5 feet tall, wearing a handmade necklace. That necklace tells us something. Either she made it herself, which suggests creativity and craft, or someone who cared about her made it for her, which suggests she was loved and valued. She rode a bicycle around Virginia Beach, independent and active. She worked and earned her paycheck. She was building a life. Judy Martins was a student advisor at Kent State, trusted with responsibility for helping other students. This tells us about her character. She was someone mature enough, reliable enough, caring enough to be given this role. She was someone who looked out for others, who took her obligations seriously. The costume she was wearing when she disappeared suggests she had been participating in something social, something fun. She had a life beyond just her responsibilities. Cheryl and Scherer was 19, working at a gas station in Scott City, Missouri. She was young, just beginning her adult life, working to support herself. She showed up for her shifts. She handled responsibility. She was trustworthy enough to be left alone at the station. She had her whole future ahead of her. These details are small, but they matter. They remind us that these were real people, not just names in case files. They had personalities, habits, relationships. They occupied space in the world. They mattered to the people who knew them, and they should matter to us, even though we never knew them, even though decades have passed since they disappeared, because they were human beings who deserved better than what happened to them. They deserved to live long lives, to achieve their goals, to experience joy and sorrow, and all the richness of human existence. Instead, their lives were cut short or at least interrupted in ways we cannot fully understand. They became mysteries, became cases, became cautionary tales. But before all of that, they were simply young women living their lives, doing ordinary things on ordinary days. Until they weren't. Until something happened that we still don't understand. that transformed them from people living their lives into people who vanished, who became absences, who became the subjects of investigations and theories and decades of wondering. Let your body sink deeper into your bed. Let the tension flow out of your muscles. These stories are heavy, but they're also important. They're worth carrying, worth remembering, worth honoring. There's something we haven't fully explored yet about these cases, about the nature of disappearance itself. When someone dies, there's a finality to it. The person is gone. Their body exists as physical proof of that ending. Grief is painful, but at least the reality is clear. This person lived, and now they have died, and there's evidence of both the living and the dying. But when someone disappears, that clarity doesn't exist. The person lived, yes. There's evidence of that. Baby pictures and school records and employment histories and all the documentation of a life in progress. But then what? They were here, and then they weren't. The transition between those states is unclear, unknown, a gap in the narrative that creates unbearable uncertainty. Are they dead? Almost certainly, in cases this old. The likelihood that someone disappeared in the 1970s and is still alive somewhere, living under a different name, having chosen to abandon their entire previous life, is vanishingly small. It's the plot of movies and novels, not the reality of missing persons cases. But almost certainly isn't the same as definitely. And that tiny sliver of possibility, however improbable, makes it impossible for families to achieve closure. How do you grieve someone who might, theoretically, still be alive somewhere? How do you accept death when death hasn't been proven? This is the particular cruelty of disappearance. Not just the loss of the person, but the loss of certainty about what happened to them. The imagination fills the void with possibilities, some of them even worse than death. Did they suffer? Are they being held somewhere against their will? Did they die quickly or slowly? Were they afraid? These questions torment families. They create scenarios in their minds, trying to understand what happened, trying to imagine their loved one's final moments. And because there are no answers, no facts to anchor these imaginings, they can spiral into terrible places. Some families have said that in some ways, finding a body, even decades later, even when it confirms the worst, brings a kind of relief. At least then they know. At least then the questions about what happened can be replaced with the known truth, however painful that truth might be. At least then they can have a funeral, can create a final resting place, can mark the ending of their loved one's life in a concrete way. But for families who never get that discovery, who never find remains, who never get confirmation of death, the uncertainty continues indefinitely. They exist in a permanent state of not knowing, unable to fully grieve, unable to fully hope, suspended in an awful middle ground. This is what the families of these 5 young women have experienced. Decades of uncertainty, decades of questions without answers, decades of imagining and wondering and hoping and despairing. And yet, somehow, they go on. They live their lives. They raise children or pursue careers or maintain relationships or simply get through each day. Because what else can they do? Life continues even in the midst of unresolved grief. Bills still need to be paid. Responsibilities still need to be met. The world keeps turning whether you're ready for it to or not. There's a resilience in this that's worth recognizing. Not the resilience of bouncing back or moving on or getting over it, but the resilience of simply continuing to exist in the face of ongoing pain. Of carrying grief and uncertainty and still finding ways to experience joy, to love people, to engage with life. The human capacity for this kind of resilience is remarkable. We can hold seemingly contradictory things simultaneously. We can grieve deeply while also laughing at a joke. We can carry the weight of loss while also appreciating a beautiful sunset. We can live with uncertainty while also making plans for the future. The families of missing persons exemplify this resilience every day. They haven't forgotten their loved ones. The pain hasn't gone away, but they've found ways to integrate that pain into their lives, to carry it without being completely crushed by it. This isn't easy. It requires enormous strength. It requires support from others, whether that's family or friends or therapists or support groups. It requires finding meaning and purpose in the midst of tragedy. It requires making a choice, every day, to keep going. And some days are harder than others. Birthdays and anniversaries and holidays are particularly difficult. The empty chair at the table becomes impossible to ignore. The memories flood back. The absence feels fresh and raw all over again. But even on those hard days, these families endure. They light candles, or visit memorial sites, or share stories about their loved ones. They find ways to honor the memory while also acknowledging the pain. They survive another anniversary, another birthday, another holiday without answers. Let's think for a moment about the passage of time in these cases. Lynn Schulz disappeared 53 years ago as of this recording. 53 years. That's more than half a century. People who weren't born when she disappeared are now grandparents themselves. The world has changed completely. And yet, her case remains unsolved. Eileen Hinson disappeared 48 years ago. Judy Sylvester 47 years ago. Judy Martins 46 years ago. Cheryl Scherer 45 years ago. These are lifetimes. These are entire generations. Think about everything that has happened in the world during these decades. Technology has revolutionized every aspect of life. The political landscape has shifted repeatedly. Cultural norms have changed dramatically. The people who were adults when these women disappeared are now elderly or deceased. The children who were born that year are now approaching retirement. But these cases remain frozen in time. The investigations may continue, new evidence may be examined, but the core mystery remains unchanged. What happened? Where are they? Who was responsible? The contrast between the enormous changes that have occurred in the world and the static nature of these unsolved cases is striking. Everything has changed, and yet nothing has changed. Time marches on for everyone except these 5 young women, whose stories stopped in the 1970s and never resumed. Their families have aged. Their siblings have gone from being young adults to being senior citizens. Parents have grown old and died. The world these women disappeared from no longer exists in any recognizable form. If they could somehow return today, they would find themselves in a completely alien landscape, a world transformed by technology and culture and time. But they're not coming back. We know this, even if it's hard to say it definitively without proof. They're gone. Whatever happened to them happened decades ago. The investigation is no longer about finding them alive. It's about finding answers, finding justice, finding closure for their families. This shift in focus happens in all missing persons cases eventually. There comes a point where the search for a living person becomes a search for remains, for evidence, for the truth about what happened. It's a painful transition, an acknowledgement that hope for a happy ending is gone. But even as the nature of the search changes, the importance doesn't diminish. Finding remains, solving the case, identifying the perpetrator, these things still matter enormously even when they can't bring the person back to life. They provide closure. They provide answers. They provide justice, or at least the possibility of justice. And they allow the family to finally, truly grieve. To hold a funeral, even if it's decades late. To have a place to visit, a grave to tend. To know, with certainty, what happened and when and how. The pain doesn't go away, but at least the uncertainty does. This is what the families of these 5 young women are still hoping for. Not for their loved ones to walk through the door, alive and well after all these decades. That's not realistic. But for answers, for closure, for the ability to finally know the truth and begin to fully process the grief they've been carrying in limbo all these years. Some of them may get this closure someday. Cold cases do get solved. Advances in technology, fresh investigative approaches, witnesses finally coming forward, these things happen. There's always hope, however faint. But some of them may never get answers. Some of these cases may remain unsolved forever. The truth lost to time and circumstance and the deaths of everyone who knew anything relevant. This is a possibility that families have to live with, the very real chance that they will die without ever knowing what happened to their loved one. Breathe deeply. Feel the weight of your blankets. You're safe and warm. These stories are from the past, and while they carry weight, they don't have power over your present moment. There's a question that often comes up in discussions of cold cases. At what point do you stop actively investigating? When do you accept that a case is unsolvable and move your limited resources to other cases that might have better prospects? This is a deeply uncomfortable question. No one wants to give up on a case. No one wants to tell a family that their loved one's disappearance is no longer being actively worked. But resources are finite. Police departments have limited budgets, limited personnel. Every hour spent on an old cold case is an hour not spent on a current case. There's no good answer to this dilemma. Some departments maintain cold case units specifically dedicated to reviewing old cases, ensuring that even if active investigation has ceased, the cases aren't completely forgotten. These units periodically review files, looking for new approaches or new technologies that might yield results. Other departments simply don't have the resources for this. They do what they can with what they have, but old cases inevitably get pushed aside by new ones, by crimes that are fresh and potentially solvable if investigated immediately. And this creates a kind of hierarchy of victims, where some cases get more attention and resources than others based on factors that may have nothing to do with the severity of the crime or the worthiness of the victim. High-profile cases get more resources. Cases with good evidence get more attention. Cases with persistent families who advocate loudly get more investigation time. This isn't fair, but it's reality. And it means that some victims, some families, get left behind. Their cases gather dust in storage. The investigators who knew the details retire or die. Institutional memory fades. The case becomes just a file number, a name in a database, a statistic in the unsolved case count. Fighting against this requires constant advocacy. Families who stay engaged, who remind law enforcement that the case still matters, who reach out to media, who connect with cold case units. These families are more likely to see their cases get attention. But not every family has the energy or resources for this kind of advocacy. Some are too devastated by grief. Some lack the knowledge of how to navigate law enforcement and media systems. Some simply burn out after years of fighting without results. And this too is unfair. The families who have already suffered the most, who have lost the most, shouldn't also have to carry the burden of keeping the investigation alive. Law enforcement should do that. Society should do that. But the reality is that advocacy matters, and families who can't or won't advocate are more likely to see their cases forgotten. This is one reason why organizations that support families of missing persons are so important. They provide advocacy training, media connections, emotional support. They help families understand the investigative process and how to effectively engage with it. They ensure that families aren't alone in their fight for answers. For the families of Lynn and Eileen and both Judas and Cheryl, these resources may or may not have been available depending on where they lived and when they sought help. Support networks for families of missing persons have grown and improved over the decades, but they're still not universally accessible or adequate. And this points to another area where progress is needed, not just in investigative techniques or forensic technology, but in support for the families left behind. These families have been traumatized. They need mental health resources, practical assistance with navigating law enforcement and legal systems, community support to help them cope with ongoing grief and uncertainty. Some jurisdictions provide these services. Victim advocates exist to support families through investigations and prosecutions. Crisis counselors can provide immediate mental health support. Support groups connect families with others who understand their experience. But access to these services varies widely. And for families dealing with disappearances that occurred decades ago, when such services were less available or didn't exist at all, the support may come too late to help with the acute crisis, but could still provide value in managing ongoing grief. The point is that solving the crime isn't the only obligation we have to victims and their families. We also owe them support, compassion, and practical help in dealing with the aftermath of victimization. And we owe this whether or not the case ever gets solved. Let your jaw relax. Let your breathing flow naturally. We're holding these stories gently, with respect and care. There's another aspect of these cases worth considering: the role of luck, both bad and good, in determining outcomes. These 5 young women were incredibly unlucky. They happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They crossed paths with someone dangerous, or encountered circumstances that led to their disappearance. If they had left 5 minutes earlier or later, taken a different route, made a different choice, they might still be alive today. This randomness is deeply unsettling. We want to believe that our choices matter, that we can protect ourselves through vigilance and smart decisions. But sometimes, random chance determines everything. Sometimes, being in a specific place at a specific moment is all it takes. The perpetrators of these crimes were, in some sense, lucky too. They avoided witnesses, or the witnesses who saw something didn't realize what they were seeing. They left no evidence, or the evidence wasn't recognized or preserved. They operated in an era when forensic science was limited and databases didn't exist. They benefited from investigative mistakes, from jurisdictional barriers, from the passage of time. This too is unsettling. We want to believe that criminals get caught, that justice prevails, that wrongdoing leads inevitably to consequences. But sometimes, criminals get lucky. Sometimes they avoid accountability through no skill of their own, just through fortunate circumstances that work in their favor. And this randomness, this role of luck in determining who gets victimized and who gets caught, challenges our sense of how the world should work. It suggests that justice is not inevitable, that being good and careful doesn't guarantee safety, that being a criminal doesn't guarantee punishment. But acknowledging this randomness doesn't mean accepting it. We can't control luck, but we can work to minimize its role. Better investigative techniques reduce the role of luck in solving crimes. Better databases and information sharing reduce the chances of criminals benefiting from jurisdictional luck. Better evidence preservation means that even if a case can't be solved immediately, luck might favor justice later when new technologies are developed. The goal is to create systems where justice is more likely, where criminals have fewer opportunities to get lucky, where victims and their families have better odds of getting answers and accountability. We're not there yet. These 5 cases demonstrate that. But we're further along than we were in the 1970s, and hopefully will continue to progress. For the families of these 5 young women, though, that progress doesn't help. Their bad luck happened before the systems improved. Their cases fell through the cracks before the cracks were filled in. And no amount of future progress undoes that past failure. This is the tragedy of being on the wrong side of historical change. The people who suffer before systems improve don't benefit from those improvements. They're the cautionary tales, the examples of why change was needed, but they don't get the protection or justice that future victims might receive. All we can do is remember them, honor them, ensure that their stories are told and their cases aren't forgotten, and commit to continuing the work of improvement so that fewer people in the future have to experience what they and their families experienced. Think about the investigators who worked these cases. The police officers and detectives who interviewed witnesses, processed scenes, followed leads, spent hours and days and weeks trying to find these young women and figure out what happened to them. Some of those investigators are still alive, now retired, carrying the weight of these unsolved cases. They remember Lynn's face, Eileen's circumstances, the details of Judy's and Cheryl's disappearances. They remember the families, the desperate hope in parents' eyes, the questions they couldn't answer. Unsolved cases haunt good investigators. They think about them for years, wondering if there was something they missed, some lead they should have pursued more aggressively, some piece of evidence they should have recognized. They carry a sense of responsibility, even though they know intellectually that they did their best with the resources and knowledge available at the time. Some of these investigators have passed away now, taking their memories and insights with them. The institutional knowledge of what was done, what was tried, what didn't work, gets lost when investigators retire or die. New investigators inheriting cold cases have to start from scratch, reading reports and trying to understand cases they weren't part of originally. This loss of institutional knowledge is one reason why documenting investigations thoroughly is so important. Written reports, recorded interviews, detailed evidence logs. These things preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But documentation in the 1970s wasn't always comprehensive or systematic. Sometimes critical details existed only in an investigator's memory, and when that investigator died, the details died too. This is another way that time works against solving cold cases. Not just through degradation of physical evidence, but through the loss of human knowledge and memory. But let's also acknowledge the dedication of those original investigators and the cold case investigators who have picked up these files in subsequent years. They care. They want to solve these cases. They feel a sense of obligation to the victims and their families. They're not indifferent or lazy or incompetent, as families sometimes feel when cases go unsolved. They're human beings doing difficult work with limited resources, working within systems that have constraints and limitations. They're trying their best, even when their best isn't enough to solve the case. This doesn't excuse failures when they occur. Investigative mistakes should be acknowledged and learned from. But it does complicate the narrative of simply blaming law enforcement when cases don't get solved. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, despite dedication and hard work and genuine care, cases remain unsolved. The evidence just isn't there. The breaks don't come. Luck doesn't favor the investigation. And a case joins the long list of mysteries that may never be answered. This is heartbreaking for everyone involved. For families, obviously, but also for investigators who have to tell families they have no answers, who have to close their notebooks knowing they've failed to bring justice. The work of being a detective on an unsolved case is uniquely difficult. You're responsible for seeking justice for someone you never knew, someone whose life was cut short before you even entered the profession. You're working with incomplete information, degraded evidence, faded memories. You're carrying the hopes of grieving families who desperately want you to succeed, who believe you're their last chance for answers. And you know, statistically, that the odds are against you. Most cold cases remain cold. Most mysteries stay mysteries. You can work hard, be thorough, use every resource available, and still end up with nothing. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the likely outcome of failure, takes a toll. Some investigators specialize in cold cases because they find the work meaningful despite its difficulty. They're drawn to the puzzle aspect, to the challenge of trying to solve something that stumped others before them. They feel a sense of purpose in giving voice to victims who have been silent for decades. Others rotate through cold case work as part of their broader duties, spending some time on old cases between handling new ones. They do their best while they're assigned to a case, but they don't have the luxury of focusing solely on decades-old mysteries when current crimes demand immediate attention. Both approaches have value. Both represent good faith efforts to serve victims and their families. But neither guarantees results. And that's the fundamental frustration of cold case work. You can do everything right and still not solve the case because the critical piece of evidence or information simply doesn't exist or can't be found. For the families of these 5 young women, this means accepting that even with dedicated investigators, even with modern technology, even with time and resources and genuine effort, their cases might never be solved. The answers they desperately want might simply not be available. This acceptance is a form of grief in itself. The death of hope, the acknowledgement that you might spend the rest of your life not knowing what happened to your loved one. It's a bitter pill, made all the more bitter by the fact that someone out there knows, or knew, the truth. The answers exist, or existed, in someone's mind. But they're not sharing, or they've died, or they've successfully hidden their knowledge for so long that it may never come to light. Let your body rest. Let yourself be held by your bed, by gravity, by the gentle rhythm of your breath. These are heavy thoughts, but they're important ones. And you're strong enough to hold them for these young women, to bear witness to their stories. There's a phrase that comes up sometimes in discussions of cold cases: getting away with murder. It's usually said with a sense of outrage, a recognition that justice has failed, that someone has committed a terrible crime and avoided consequences. But what does it mean to get away with murder, really? Does it mean avoiding legal punishment? Certainly that's part of it. If you kill someone and are never arrested, never tried, never convicted, you have, in a legal sense, gotten away with it. But does getting away with it mean avoiding all consequences? That's less clear. Some killers who were never caught for their crimes lived the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, paranoid about being discovered. Some were consumed by guilt, unable to enjoy the life they thought they were preserving by killing. Some were caught for other crimes and spent years in prison even if they were never held accountable for the specific murder they committed. And some, perhaps, truly did get away with it in every sense. They killed, they avoided detection, they lived comfortable lives free from guilt or fear, and they died peacefully without ever being held accountable. This possibility is deeply disturbing, a violation of our sense that the universe should have some kind of moral order, some mechanism for ensuring that evil is punished. But the universe doesn't work that way. Justice is a human construct, something we create through our systems and institutions. When those systems fail, when institutions don't function as they should, injustice happens. And sometimes, that injustice is never corrected. For the perpetrators of these 5 disappearances, we don't know which scenario played out. We don't know if they lived in fear or guilt, if they were caught for other crimes, if they died peacefully or tormented. We don't even know for certain if they're all dead, though given the passage of time, it's likely. What we do know is that they have not, so far, been held legally accountable for what they did. They have gotten away with it in that specific, legal sense. And that failure of justice is something we have to acknowledge and grapple with. Does acknowledging this failure mean accepting it? No. It means recognizing reality while also committing to doing better, to creating systems that make such failures less likely in the future. It means holding space for both the reality that justice has not been served and the hope that someday it might be. And it means supporting the families who live with this failure every day, who know that the person who destroyed their lives faced no consequences, or at least no consequences that the family knows about. This knowledge is corrosive, eating away at the sense that the world is fair or just. Some families find peace through other means. Through faith, perhaps, believing that there's a higher justice that will eventually be served even if earthly justice fails. Through focusing on preserving their loved one's memory rather than pursuing the perpetrator. Through advocacy work that gives meaning to their suffering by helping others. These coping mechanisms don't erase the injustice, but they provide a way to live with it, to not be completely consumed by anger and bitterness and the desire for revenge. Other families can't find that peace. They remain focused on the perpetrator, on the desire to see them caught and punished, on the anger that fuels their advocacy. This is equally valid. There's no right way to cope with this kind of injustice. What matters is that families have support whatever their approach, that they're not judged for how they choose to handle their grief and anger, that resources are available whether they want to pursue justice actively or find other paths to peace. Think about how media coverage of these cases has evolved over the decades. In the 1970s, coverage was limited to local newspapers and perhaps brief mentions on local TV news. If a case wasn't solved quickly, media attention dried up. There was no internet to keep stories alive, no social media to spread awareness, no true crime podcasts to revisit cases years later. Families had limited options for keeping their loved ones' cases in the public eye. They could reach out to local media on anniversaries, hoping for a story that might generate new tips. They could put up flyers, though those would fade and tear and eventually be covered over by newer flyers for other missing persons. They could talk to anyone who would listen, but their audience was limited. Today, the media landscape is completely different. True crime has become a massive genre, with dedicated TV channels, countless podcasts, YouTube channels, online forums, subreddits devoted to discussing cold cases. This increased attention has both benefits and drawbacks. On the positive side, cases that might have been forgotten get national or even international attention. The increased awareness can generate new tips, can put pressure on law enforcement to dedicate resources to investigation, can keep the public engaged with missing persons issues. On the negative side, this attention can be exploitative, treating real tragedies as entertainment. Online sleuths sometimes engage in harmful speculation, accusing innocent people without evidence, harassing families, interfering with investigations. The quality of coverage varies wildly, from respectful and thorough to sensationalistic and harmful. For families, navigating this media landscape is complicated. They want attention for their cases, want their loved ones' stories told, want the public engaged and watching for information. But they also want their loved ones treated with respect, want accurate information shared, want to be protected from harassment and harmful speculation. Some families embrace media attention, working actively with podcasters and documentary makers, using social media to advocate for their cases. Others find it overwhelming and invasive, preferring to grieve privately while letting law enforcement handle investigation. Again, there's no right approach. Different families have different needs and different comfort levels with public attention. What matters is that they have agency, that they get to decide how their loved one's story is told, that they're not exploited by media that prioritizes entertainment value over respect for victims and families. The cases of Lynn, Eileen, Judy Sylvester, Judy Martins, and Cheryl have been covered to varying degrees by true crime media. Lynn's case got significant attention when the Robert Durst connection emerged. The others have been discussed in various forums and articles, but haven't achieved the same level of national attention. This disparity in coverage isn't based on the worthiness of the victims or the severity of the crimes. It's based on factors like whether there's a compelling hook for the story, whether there's a famous person connected to it, whether there's visual material available, whether the family is willing and able to engage with media. These factors have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the mechanics of media and public attention. But they have real effects on which cases get resources, which families get support, which perpetrators might be identified through public tips. So we end up with an imperfect system where some victims get more attention than others based on factors beyond anyone's control. It's not fair, but it's the reality we're working with. The challenge is to use media attention responsibly when it exists, while also not forgetting the cases that don't capture public imagination. Let yourself sink deeper into relaxation. Your breathing is slow and steady. The weight of these stories is real, but you're carrying it with grace, honoring these lives by listening. There's something profound about the collective nature of these 5 stories. We've talked about them individually, examined their unique circumstances, honored them as separate people with separate lives. But there's also value in thinking about them together as representatives of a larger phenomenon. How many other young women disappeared in the 1970s and were never found? How many cases like these exist in police files across the country? The 5 we've discussed tonight are just the ones we've chosen to focus on, but they're far from the only ones. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System has thousands of cases dating back to the 70s and earlier. Thousands of people who disappeared and were never found, whose families still wait for answers, whose cases sit cold in storage somewhere. This scale of loss is almost incomprehensible. Each one of those thousands of cases represents a person, a family, a tragedy. Each one deserves attention and resources and effort to solve. But the sheer number makes that impossible. We don't have enough investigators, enough resources, enough time to give each case what it deserves. So triage happens. Priorities are set. Some cases get more attention than others. And families of the cases that don't get prioritized feel abandoned, feel that their loved one has been deemed less important, less worthy of justice. This is one of the cruel mathematics of limited resources. Every hour spent on one case is an hour not spent on another. Every dollar allocated to investigation is a dollar not available for something else. Choices have to be made, and those choices mean some victims and families get less than they need and deserve. There's no easy solution to this. We could increase funding for law enforcement, hire more investigators, dedicate more resources to cold cases. These things would help. But even with increased resources, there would still be more cases than could be fully worked. The backlog is simply too large. Some advocates argue for different approaches to prioritization. Rather than focusing on cases most likely to be solved, why not focus on cases where families are most in need of answers? Or cases where the victim was most vulnerable? Or cases that have been cold the longest? Each approach has merit, but each also has drawbacks. And any prioritization system will inevitably leave some families feeling overlooked. Perhaps the answer is not to find the perfect prioritization system, but to be honest about the limitations we're working with, and to continuously work toward expanding capacity so that more cases can receive adequate attention. In the meantime, families wait. Some of them have been waiting for 50 years or more. They've aged with their grief, grown old carrying the weight of uncertainty. Some have died waiting. Others continue to wait, knowing that time is running out, that they may not live long enough to get the answers they need. This is the reality of cold cases in America. It's not satisfying. It's not just, but it's what we're dealing with. And acknowledging this reality is the first step toward changing it. For Lynn's sister, for Cheryl's family, for whoever remains from Eileen's and Judy's families, this reality is deeply personal. These aren't abstract policy discussions. This is their lived experience, their daily reality of waiting and hoping and advocating and grieving. They deserve better. They deserve a system that could have protected their loved ones in the first place, that could have solved their cases when they went cold, that could at least now provide them with answers even if justice is no longer possible. They haven't gotten that. And for that, as a society, we should feel a collective sense of failure and responsibility. Let's talk about memory for a moment. How do we remember people who disappeared? What form does that memory take? For people who died, there are graves to visit, headstones with names and dates, physical markers of a life lived and ended. There are obituaries that tell the story of that life. There are death certificates that make the ending official, concrete, real. But for people who disappeared, memory has to exist without these physical anchors. There's no grave to tend, no headstone to read. The missing person remains in a kind of liminal space, not quite dead, but not quite alive in our understanding. Families create their own memorials. They keep rooms unchanged, preserving their loved one's space exactly as it was. They hold annual remembrance ceremonies. They create online tributes or memorial pages. They tell stories, share photographs, keep the person present in conversation and memory. These acts of remembrance serve multiple purposes. They honor the missing person, ensuring they're not forgotten. They provide comfort to the family, giving them concrete ways to express their ongoing connection to their loved one. And they keep the case visible, reminding law enforcement and the public that this person is still missing, still deserving of attention and effort to find answers. But memory is also painful. Every act of remembrance is also an acknowledgement of absence. Every photograph looked at, every story told, every ceremony held, these things reinforce the reality that the person is gone, that they're not coming back. So families have to balance the desire to remember with the need to protect themselves from being constantly re-traumatized by memory. Some find healthy ways to do this, creating boundaries around when and how they engage with memories. Others struggle with this balance, finding that memory becomes consuming, that they can't escape the past. And as time passes, as the person who disappeared recedes further into history, memory itself becomes less vivid. Siblings and friends who knew the missing person grow old, their memories fading with age. Younger family members who were born after the disappearance know their missing relative only through stories and photographs, secondhand memory rather than direct experience. Eventually, everyone who knew the person firsthand will die. The missing person will exist only in photographs and documents and stories passed down through generations. Their absence will be historical rather than immediate, a fact of family history rather than a living grief. This transition is bittersweet. On one hand, it represents a kind of healing, a moving forward as grief becomes less acute with generational distance. On the other hand, it represents a deeper kind of loss, the final fading of direct memory, the reduction of a complete human being to a story, a case, a name. For Lynn Scholes, we're approaching this transition. Her parents are gone. Her sister is aging. Soon, everyone who knew Lynn directly will be gone, and she will exist only in the memories of those who never met her, who know her only as the girl who disappeared from Middlebury College in 1971. This doesn't mean she'll be forgotten entirely. Her case will remain in records, will occasionally be mentioned in true crime discussions, will perhaps someday be solved. But the living memory of her as a person, as a sister and daughter and friend, will fade. The same is true for the others. We're in a transitional period where some direct memory still exists, but it's fading. Another generation or two, and these young women will be known only historically, not personally. This is the nature of time and memory. It's inevitable, but it's also sad, a final layer of loss added to the original tragedy. What we can do, what we should do, is ensure that even as direct memory fades, these women are remembered with dignity and respect, that their cases remain active, that investigation continues, that they're treated as more than just cold case numbers. We can tell their stories, as we're doing tonight, in ways that honor them as people first. We can advocate for the resources and policies that might someday solve their cases or prevent similar cases in the future. We can support their families in whatever ways they need. These are small things, perhaps, in the face of such profound loss and injustice. But they matter. They represent the human commitment to not forgetting, to continuing to care, to working toward justice even when justice seems impossible. Take a deep breath. Let your muscles soften. Feel the quiet of the night around you. These young women lived. They mattered. Their stories deserve to be told and heard. And you, by listening, by bearing witness, are honoring them. That's a generous and important thing you're doing. As we move toward the end of our time together tonight, I want us to think about what we take away from these stories. What do they teach us? What should we remember? First, they remind us of the fragility of life, of how quickly everything can change. These 5 young women woke up on ordinary days, went about ordinary activities, and never came home. They had no warning, no chance to say goodbye, no opportunity to prepare. This could happen to anyone. We live with this knowledge quietly, trying not to think about it too much because it's too frightening. But these cases force us to confront it. Second, They remind us of the importance of vigilance without paranoia. We can't live in constant fear, can't suspect everyone around us of having dark intentions. But we can be aware of our surroundings, can trust our instincts when something feels wrong, can take reasonable precautions without letting fear control our lives. Third, they remind us of the value of human connection, of letting people know where we are and when we'll be back, of maintaining relationships that notice when we're absent. The people in our lives are our safety net. When we disappear, they're the ones who sound the alarm, who push for investigation, who refuse to let us be forgotten. Fourth, they remind us that justice is not guaranteed, that systems fail, that sometimes terrible things happen and no one is held accountable. This is uncomfortable knowledge, but it's important. It motivates us to work toward better systems, better protections, better investigations. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, they remind us of the humanity of victims. These were not just cases, not just mysteries to solve. They were people. They had dreams and fears and quirks and habits. They were loved. They mattered. And they continue to matter, even decades after they disappeared. This last lesson is perhaps the most crucial. In our fascination with true crime, in our engagement with mysteries and investigations, we can sometimes lose sight of the human beings at the center of these stories. We get caught up in theories and evidence and speculation, treating real tragedies as puzzles to solve. But these weren't puzzles. These were lives. And the families left behind aren't characters in a story. They're real people experiencing real, ongoing grief. When we engage with true crime, when we discuss these cases, when we theorize about what might have happened, we have a responsibility to remember this, to center the humanity of victims and their families, to be respectful in our curiosity, to recognize that these are not entertainment, even if we engage with them through entertainment media. Lynn Schulz was a person. Eileen Henson was a person. Judy Sylvester was a person. Judy Martins was a person. Cheryl and Scherer was a person. They lived. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered with dignity. Their families are people too, real people who have endured decades of grief and uncertainty. They deserve our compassion, our respect, our support. They deserve systems that work, investigations that continue, hope that answers might someday come. And the communities where these disappearances occurred are real communities, changed by these tragedies in ways both visible and invisible. They carry the weight of these unsolved mysteries, the knowledge that terrible things happened in their midst and were never fully understood or resolved. All of these people, all of these communities, deserve better than they got. They deserve a world where young women can walk across campus or work at gas stations or prepare for weddings without disappearing. They deserve investigations that solve cases quickly and bring perpetrators to justice. They deserve closure and answers and peace. They haven't gotten that. And that failure belongs to all of us, collectively. We've built systems that sometimes fail to protect people and fail to deliver justice when protection fails. We can do better. We must do better. And part of doing better is remembering. Remembering these 5 young women not as cold case numbers, but as people. Remembering their families and their ongoing grief. Remembering that unsolved cases represent failures that we should work to prevent in the future. Let your breathing deepen. Let sleep begin to pull at you gently. We're nearly at the end of our time together tonight. Just a little while longer, and then you can drift off, carrying these stories with you, but not being weighed down by them. As we begin to close out this long journey through 5 unsolved cases from the 1970s, I want to circle back to where we began, to the decade itself, to the particular moment in history when these disappearances occurred. The 1970s were a time of tremendous change in America. The Vietnam War was winding down, leaving the country fractured and questioning. The Watergate scandal had shaken faith in government and institutions. The economy was struggling with inflation and energy crises. Social movements were pushing for civil rights, women's rights, environmental protection. It was a time when old certainties were crumbling and new ways of living were being explored. Young people were particularly engaged in this cultural shift, rejecting the conformity of their parents' generation, seeking independence and authenticity in new experiences. This spirit of independence and exploration created opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. Young women were claiming freedoms that previous generations hadn't had. They were traveling alone, living independently, making their own choices without male supervision or protection. This was progress. This was liberation. But it also meant navigating a world that wasn't always safe for them. The safety nets that exist now didn't exist then. No cell phones to call for help. No GPS to track locations. No security cameras to record what happened. No centralized databases to connect crimes across jurisdictions. No Amber Alerts to mobilize communities within hours. Young women in the 70s were pioneering a new kind of independence with none of the technological safeguards we now take for granted. They were vulnerable in ways they may not have fully understood, walking through a world that still held dangers that our modern systems are designed to protect against. This doesn't mean their independence was wrong or that they were to blame for what happened to them. The blame belongs entirely to the people who victimized them. But it does help us understand the context in which these disappearances occurred, why they were possible in ways that might be less likely today. And it reminds us that progress is uneven. We made progress in terms of women's independence and freedom before we made corresponding progress in safety and protection. This gap created a window of vulnerability that these 5 young women fell through. We've closed that gap somewhat. The technologies and systems we have now provide more protection than existed then. But we shouldn't be complacent. New vulnerabilities emerge as our world changes. New threats appear that we haven't yet developed protections against. The work of keeping people safe is ongoing, requiring constant adaptation and improvement. For the families of these 5 young women, thinking about historical context provides cold comfort at best. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring their loved ones back. It doesn't solve the cases or deliver justice. But perhaps it provides some small measure of understanding, some framework for making sense of how these tragedies occurred. And perhaps it motivates us, collectively, to continue working toward a world where fewer people experience what these families have experienced, where the gaps in our systems are smaller, where the window of vulnerability is narrower, where young people can exercise their independence with greater safety. Let's think about the concept of closure for a moment, because it's something that comes up frequently in discussions of cold cases, but isn't always well understood. Closure is often presented as the goal of solving a case. If we can just find out what happened, the thinking goes, the family can achieve closure and move on with their lives. But this is a simplification that doesn't reflect the complexity of grief and trauma. First, closure isn't really a thing in the way we often talk about it. Grief doesn't end. Loss doesn't stop mattering just because you know the facts of what happened. Parents who have found their murdered children's bodies and seen their killers convicted still grieve, still miss their children, still carry the weight of that loss every day. What changes when a case is solved isn't that grief ends, but that one particular aspect of suffering, the not knowing, is resolved. The uncertainty lifts. The questions are answered. This is significant, don't misunderstand. But it's not the same as closure in the sense of being finished with grief. Second, different families need different things. For some, knowing what happened is enough, even without a conviction. For others, only seeing the perpetrator punished provides any sense of resolution. For still others, finding remains so they can have a burial is what matters most. There's no universal answer to what constitutes closure. Third, some families actively resist the concept of closure. They don't want to close this chapter of their lives because doing so feels like moving on from their loved one, like leaving them behind. They want to continue fighting, continue advocating, continue keeping their loved one's case alive. For them, closure isn't the goal. So when we talk about solving these cases, we should be careful about framing it as providing closure. What we're really providing is information, answers, the truth about what happened. Whether that leads to anything resembling closure is up to the individual family and depends on countless factors we can't predict or control. For the families of Lynn, Eileen, Judy Sylvester, Judy Martins, and Cheryl, the path forward if their cases were solved would be unique to each family. Some might feel a sense of resolution. Others might find that knowing the truth brings new pain, new questions, new challenges to process. There's no way to know until it happens. But what we can say with certainty is that they deserve the opportunity to find out. They deserve to know the truth, whatever that truth is and however it affects them. The not knowing is its own kind of torture, and ending that torture by providing answers is a basic act of compassion and justice. Whether we call that closure or something else, whether it ends their grief or simply transforms it, is less important than the fundamental obligation to pursue truth and justice on behalf of victims and their families. Think about the ripple effects we've discussed throughout these stories. The way one violent act spreads outward, affecting not just the victim but family, friends, community, society. Each of these 5 disappearances created ripples that are still spreading 50 years later. Siblings who grew up in households marked by grief and absence. Children and grandchildren who were born into families still waiting for answers. Communities that lost their sense of safety. Investigators who carried the weight of unsolved cases throughout their careers. These ripples are invisible in some ways. You can't measure them precisely. You can't quantify the collective trauma or calculate the total impact. But they're real. They've shaped lives and communities in profound ways. And they remind us that violent crime is never just about the immediate victim and perpetrator. It's about entire networks of people whose lives are changed, entire communities whose sense of security is shattered, entire systems that are challenged to respond and often found wanting. When we talk about the costs of unsolved violent crime, we need to think about these ripple effects. The cost isn't just in investigative resources or in the one life lost. It's in the decades of grief, the families torn apart, the communities changed, the trust eroded, the fear that lingers. These costs are borne quietly, privately, by people who had no choice but to bear them. They're the hidden casualties of violent crime, the collateral damage that extends far beyond the immediate victim. Recognizing these costs should motivate us to do better, to invest in prevention, in investigation, in support for families, to build systems that minimize both the initial harm and the ongoing ripple effects, to take seriously the full scope of damage that violence creates. Let your body relax completely. Feel yourself sinking into sleep's embrace. We're almost done with our journey tonight. Just a little longer. There's something we should acknowledge about the act of telling these stories, of spending hours discussing 5 unsolved disappearances from decades ago. Why do we do this? What purpose does it serve? On one level, it's about remembrance, about ensuring that these 5 young women are not forgotten, that their cases remain visible and present in public consciousness. This serves the families who want their loved ones remembered. It serves the cases themselves by keeping them alive in the cultural memory, which sometimes leads to new tips or renewed investigative efforts. On another level, it's about education, about understanding how violent crime happens, how investigations work, how systems fail and succeed. This knowledge can help us be more informed citizens, better advocates for victims, more effective in pushing for reforms and improvements. On yet another level, if we're honest, there's an element of fascination, of being drawn to mystery and tragedy in ways that aren't entirely noble. True crime appeals to something in human nature, a curiosity about darkness, about the extremes of human behavior, about questions that challenge our understanding of how the world works. This fascination isn't inherently bad, but it needs to be balanced with respect and compassion. We can be curious about these cases while also centering the humanity of the victims. We can engage with the mystery while also honoring the grief of the families. We can find these stories compelling without treating them as mere entertainment. The key is intentionality, being conscious of why we're drawn to these stories and what we're doing with that interest. Are we using it to advocate for victims? To educate ourselves and others? To push for systemic improvements? Or are we just consuming tragedy for its entertainment value? Tonight, in telling these 5 stories, the goal has been the former. To remember these young women respectfully, to understand their cases in context, to honor their families' ongoing pain, to motivate ourselves to work toward a world where such tragedies are less likely and more solvable when they do occur. If you've stayed with these stories through all these hours, you've done something meaningful. You've borne witness. You've held space for these 5 lives. You've honored them by listening, by caring, by refusing to let them be forgotten. That matters. It may not solve their cases or ease their family's pain directly, but it contributes to a culture that values victims, that takes violence seriously, that refuses to accept unsolved cases as inevitable. And in some small way, your attention tonight might matter in more concrete ways. Perhaps you'll remember these names if you ever hear them mentioned elsewhere. Perhaps you'll share these stories with others who might have information. Perhaps you'll be inspired to support organizations that help families of missing persons or that work to solve cold cases. Or perhaps the impact will be more subtle. Perhaps you'll think differently about missing persons cases you encounter in the news. Perhaps you'll be more compassionate toward families dealing with loss. Perhaps you'll be more aware of the vulnerabilities that still exist in our systems and more committed to addressing them. Any of these outcomes would make tonight's time worthwhile. Any of these would honor Lynn and Eileen and Judy and Cheryl in meaningful ways. As we prepare to close, let me bring us back once more to the specific human beings at the center of these stories. Not the theories or the investigations or the systemic issues, but the 5 young women themselves. Lynn Scholes was 18 years old when she disappeared. 18. Think about what that means. She had barely begun her adult life. She had decades ahead of her, so many experiences she would never have. She would never finish college, never pursue a career, never fall in love or marry or have children. She would never travel the world or read all the books she wanted to read or become whoever she was meant to become. All of that potential, all of that future, was taken from her in December of 1971. Eileen Hinson was 19, just 1 year older than Lynn. She was preparing for a wedding, participating in a celebration of love and new beginnings. She packed a suitcase for a trip she would never take. She had plans, things she was looking forward to, a future she thought was assured. And then, in April of 1976, all of that ended. Judy Sylvester was 24, already a few years into adult independence. She had a job, responsibilities, a bicycle she rode around Virginia Beach. She was building a life for herself, making her way in the world. She should have picked up her paycheck from that shift she never worked. She should have gone home that day. She should have had decades more to live. Instead, in April of 1977, she vanished. Judy Martins was a student advisor at Kent State, trusted with responsibility, helping other students navigate college life. She put on a costume for some event, planning to walk just 300 yards across campus. Just 300 yards. That short walk should have been completely safe, completely routine. But in November of 1978, something happened in those 300 yards, and she was never seen again. Cheryl and Scherer was 19, working her shift at a gas station in Scott City, Missouri. She was doing her job, earning money, living independently. She should have finished her shift and gone home. The money from the register should still be in the register. Her car should have taken her wherever she needed to go next. But in April of 1979, someone took her, and she never came home. 5 young women. 5 lives full of potential. 5 futures that never happened. 5 families left to grieve and wonder and wait for answers that may never come. This is what we remember. This is what matters. Not the mystery, not the theories, not the speculation. But these 5 human beings who lived and who deserved so much better than what happened to them. Their families remember them this way. Not as cold cases or statistics or mysteries, but as daughters, sisters, friends. As people who laughed and cried and had favorite songs and foods they didn't like. As people who had inside jokes with friends and dreams they shared late at night. As people who were irreplaceable, whose absence created holes that can never be filled. When Lynn's sister thinks about her, she doesn't think about Robert Durst or anonymous tips or police investigations. She thinks about her sister. The girl she grew up with, the memories they shared, the future they should have had together. The sister relationship that was cut short, leaving her alone to carry the family memory. When Cheryl's family gathers for remembrance ceremonies in Scott City, they're not thinking about Henry Lee Lucas's confessions or investigative failures. They're thinking about Cheryl. The 19-year-old girl who should be a 64-year-old woman by now, who should have lived a full life, should have had her own family, should have grown old with the people who loved her. This is the human reality behind every cold case. Real people grieving real losses. Not characters in a story, not puzzles to solve, but human beings processing unbearable pain and living with questions that may never be answered. And they need us to remember this. They need us to see their loved ones as people first, always. They need us to engage with these cases respectfully, compassionately, with full awareness of the real human costs involved. So as we close tonight, as you prepare to drift into sleep, hold these 5 young women in your heart. Remember them as people. Honor them by refusing to let them be reduced to mysteries or theories or speculation. Lynn Scholes. Say her name quietly to yourself. She was real. She mattered. She deserves to be remembered. Eileen Hinson. She existed. She had a life that was taken from her. She deserves justice, even now, all these years later. Judy Sylvester, 5 feet tall, wearing a handmade necklace. A real person, not a theory about a serial killer. She deserves to be honored for who she was. Judy Martins, a student advisor who helped others. A person who walked 300 yards and never arrived. She deserves answers about what happened in that short distance. Cheryl and Scherer, 19 years old, working at a gas station. Taken in broad daylight. She deserves justice for what was done to her. These 5 young women. These 5 lives. These 5 families still waiting. This is what we carry with us from tonight. Let yourself breathe deeply. Let your muscles release their tension. These stories are heavy, but you've held them with care and respect. You've honored these lives by listening, by bearing witness, by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths. The weight of these stories is real, but it doesn't have to crush you. You can hold them gently, can remember them without being overwhelmed, can care about these cases while also taking care of yourself. You're safe in your bed. The night is quiet around you. These tragedies happened long ago, in a different time, in places far from where you are now. They're important to remember, but they don't threaten your immediate safety. You can honor these 5 young women by living your life fully, by being aware but not paralyzed by fear, by supporting efforts to prevent violence and solve cold cases, by treating victims and their families with compassion and respect. And you can rest now. You've done the important work of listening, of caring, of remembering. That's enough. That's meaningful. That matters. As sleep begins to pull at you, let these stories settle into a quiet place in your memory. Not forgotten, but not overwhelming. Held with respect and compassion, honored by your attention, but not dominating your thoughts or disturbing your rest. 5 young women who lived, who mattered, who deserved to be remembered. You've honored them tonight. And that's a generous, important thing you've done. Breathe deeply. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Feel the weight of your body against your mattress, supported and held. The darkness around you is peaceful, safe, gentle. We're going to move now into our final reflections, but the tone will remain calm and quiet, designed to ease you into sleep rather than to stimulate or agitate. Let yourself drift if you need to. The words will continue, soft and steady, like a lullaby for heavy hearts. As we come to the end of our time together tonight, I want to take a moment to think about hope. It might seem strange to talk about hope in the context of 5 unsolved disappearances from decades ago, but hope is what keeps these cases alive, what motivates families to continue searching, what drives cold case investigators to keep working on files that have been cold for longer than they've been alive. Hope is a complicated thing in these circumstances. It's not the hope that these young women are still alive somewhere, living happy lives under different names. That kind of hope disappeared years ago, decades ago for most of these families. The passage of time makes that outcome impossible to believe in. But there's still hope for answers. Hope that someone will come forward with information. Hope that new technology will unlock evidence that has sat in storage for decades. Hope that a fresh set of eyes reviewing the case will see something that was missed before. Hope that someday, somehow, the mystery will be solved and families will finally know the truth. This hope is what gets families out of bed on the hardest days. What motivates them to talk to journalists and investigators and anyone who might be able to help. What drives them to participate in remembrance ceremonies and anniversary articles and true crime podcasts. They hope that this time, this retelling of the story, might be the one that generates the tip that breaks the case open. Is that hope realistic? Sometimes. Cold cases do get solved. The technology exists to solve cases that would have been impossible to solve even 10 years ago. Witnesses do come forward after decades of silence. Deathbed confessions do happen. Evidence does get re-examined and yield new results. But sometimes hope is not realistic. Sometimes cases remain unsolved forever. Sometimes the answers died with the perpetrator or with a witness who stayed silent until their own death. Sometimes the evidence simply doesn't exist or has degraded beyond usefulness. This uncertainty, this not knowing whether hope is justified or futile, is its own kind of torture. But families hold on to it anyway, because what's the alternative? Despair? Acceptance? Giving up? For many families, holding on to hope, even unlikely hope, feels better than the alternative. It gives them something to work toward, a reason to keep engaging with the case, a way to stay connected to their missing loved one. And who are we to judge that hope, or to tell families it's time to let go? They've earned the right to hope for as long as they need to. They've lived with this loss in ways we can barely imagine. Their hope, however fragile or unlikely, is theirs to hold. For some families, hope has paid off. Cases have been solved. Answers have come. Justice has been served, sometimes decades late, but still meaningful. These successes sustain hope for other families. Proof that the impossible can sometimes become possible. The Golden State Killer case, which we mentioned earlier, is the most famous example. For 40 years, that case seemed unsolvable. The killer had stopped committing crimes, had disappeared into normal life somewhere, seemed untouchable. And then, genetic genealogy provided the breakthrough that led to his arrest and conviction. If that case could be solved after 40 years, why not these? Why not Lynn's case or Eileen's or any of the others? The science exists. The databases are there. The investigators are willing. What's needed is the right piece of evidence, the right connection, the right convergence of circumstances. It could happen. That's what hope rests on. Not certainty, not even probability, but possibility. The chance that someday, somehow, answers will come. And in the meantime, while families wait and hope, they also live. They've found ways to integrate this loss into their lives, to carry it without being destroyed by it. They've built careers, raised families, pursued hobbies, experienced joy alongside their grief. This resilience deserves recognition. It's not that they've moved on or gotten over it. They haven't. They never will. But they've learned to live with it, to make space for both grief and joy, loss and love, despair and hope. This is what long-term grief often looks like. Not the acute, overwhelming pain of fresh loss, but a chronic ache that becomes part of the background of life. Always there, sometimes more noticeable than others, but manageable most days. The families of these 5 young women have lived with this chronic grief for decades now. They've learned its rhythms, know when it will flare up, have developed coping strategies. They've become experts in carrying unbearable weight while still functioning in the world. And they've found meaning in their suffering, many of them, through advocacy, through helping other families of missing persons, through working to improve the systems that failed their loved ones. They've taken their pain and transformed it into purpose. This doesn't make the pain worth it. Nothing could make this kind of loss worth it. But it does give the pain some meaning beyond itself, some productive outlet, some way to ensure that their loved one's death or disappearance contributed to preventing other tragedies. Lynn's sister, in continuing to speak about Lynn's case, is not just seeking answers for herself. She's also raising awareness about missing persons issues, keeping cold cases in the public eye, reminding people that unsolved cases matter. Her advocacy has meaning beyond her personal grief. Cheryl's family, in participating in annual remembrance ceremonies in Scott City, is doing more than remembering Cheryl. They're also keeping the community connected to this piece of its history, reminding law enforcement that the case remains important, demonstrating to other families of missing persons that they're not alone in their long wait for justice. These acts of advocacy and remembrance serve multiple purposes. They honor the missing person. They keep the case active. They support other families. They push for systemic improvements. They transform private grief into public purpose. Not every family has the capacity for this kind of advocacy, and that's okay. There's no obligation to turn personal tragedy into public activism. Grief is personal, and everyone processes it in their own way. But for those families who do choose this path, who do transform their pain into purpose, we owe them our support and our attention. When they speak, we should listen. When they advocate for change, we should support them. When they ask for help keeping their loved one's case alive, we should provide it. These families are doing work that benefits all of us. They're improving systems, raising awareness, preventing future tragedies. They're doing this work while carrying unbearable grief. The least we can do is honor their efforts with our attention and support. Let your breathing slow. Let sleep begin to take you. We're in the gentle closing now, the quiet ending to a long night of difficult stories. There's one more thing I want to address before we close, and that's the question of what you, listening to this right now, can do. You've spent hours hearing about these 5 cases, learning about these 5 young women and their families. What, if anything, are you supposed to do with this information? First, you can simply remember. Remember Lynn and Eileen and both Judas and Cheryl. Remember that they were real people who lived real lives. Remember that their families still wait for answers. Remembering, in itself, is meaningful. It ensures these women aren't forgotten, that their cases remain part of our collective consciousness. Second, if you feel moved to do so, you can share their stories. Talk about these cases with others. Post about them on social media if that's something you do. The more people who know about these cases, the greater the chance that someone with relevant information will come forward. Third, you can support organizations that help families of missing persons. There are nonprofits that provide resources, advocacy, and support to these families. If you have the means to donate or volunteer, these organizations do important work and deserve support. Fourth, you can advocate for policies and resources that help solve cold cases and prevent future ones. Support funding for cold case units. Advocate for better missing persons databases. Push for policies that prioritize taking missing persons reports seriously from the very beginning. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, you can carry the awareness these stories provide into your daily life. Be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts. Let people know where you're going and when you'll be back. Teach young people in your life about safety without teaching them to live in fear. And if someone you know goes missing, take it seriously immediately. Don't assume they've run away or that they'll come back on their own. Report it quickly. Advocate for swift action. The first hours matter enormously, and time is a luxury missing persons cases don't have. These are small things, perhaps. They won't directly solve Lynn's case or Eileen's or any of the others. But they contribute to a culture that values victims, that takes violence seriously, that works to prevent tragedies and solve them when prevention fails. And that culture, built through millions of small individual acts of awareness and advocacy and compassion, makes a real difference. It saves lives. It solves cases. It supports families. It prevents future tragedies. So your attention tonight, your willingness to spend hours listening to these stories, your compassion for these 5 young women and their families, these things matter. They're not abstract or meaningless. They're part of building a better, safer world. Let yourself settle deeper into rest. Your eyes are heavy. Your body is relaxed. You've done good work tonight, bearing witness to these stories, honoring these lives. As we move toward the end, I want to return one last time to the 5 young women themselves, to leave you with their images, their humanity, their importance. Lynn Scholes, 18 years old, intelligent and sensitive, a freshman finding her way in college. She mentioned missing a bus to New York City, and we still don't know what she meant, where she wanted to go, what she was thinking about. But we know she was thinking, planning, dreaming. She was a full human being with an interior life we'll never fully understand. And she deserved to live that life fully, to pursue those dreams, to become whoever she was meant to become. Eileen Henson, 19 years old, participating in wedding preparations. She packed a suitcase with care, choosing what to bring, anticipating a trip that never happened. She was engaged with life, looking forward to celebrations and gatherings and the social rituals that connect us all. She should have attended that wedding. She should have danced and celebrated and made memories. Instead, she disappeared, and all we have is the suitcase she left behind. Judy Sylvester, 24 years old, 5 feet tall, wearing a handmade necklace that tells us someone cared enough to make something special for her, or that she cared enough to make it herself. She rode her bicycle around Virginia Beach, independent and capable. She worked and earned her living. She was building an adult life, claiming independence, making her way in the world. She should have had decades more to continue that journey. Judy Martins, a student advisor at Kent State, trusted with responsibility for helping other students. She cared about others, took her obligations seriously, was mature enough to be given a leadership role. She put on a costume for some campus event, planning to walk just 300 yards. Such a short distance, such an ordinary task. And yet somewhere in those 300 yards, her life ended or changed forever in ways we still don't understand. Cheryl and Scherer, 19 years old, working at a gas station in Scott City, responsible enough to be left alone during her shift, trustworthy with money, with customers, with the business. She showed up for work that day not knowing it would be her last shift, not knowing that someone would take her and $480 and leave everything else behind. She should have finished her shift and gone home and continued living her life. 5 young women, 5 lives that mattered, 5 families that still grieve, 5 cases that still wait for resolution. This is what we remember. This is what we carry forward. This is what we honor by listening, by caring, by refusing to forget. Your breathing is deep and slow now. Sleep is close, waiting to receive you. Let these 5 young women rest in your memory gently, honored but not heavy, remembered but not overwhelming. They lived. That's the most important thing. Before they disappeared, before they became cases and mysteries, they lived. They laughed and cried and hoped and feared and dreamed. They were real. They mattered. They still matter. And by remembering them, by hearing their stories, by honoring their humanity, you've done something meaningful tonight. You've ensured they're not forgotten. You've borne witness to their lives and to their families' ongoing grief. You've cared. And that caring, that compassion, that willingness to sit with difficult stories and hold space for victims, that's important. That's good. That matters. So rest now. Let sleep take you. You've earned this rest through the emotional work you've done tonight. You've held heavy stories with care and respect. You've honored 5 lives that deserved better than what happened to them. Breathe deeply. Let your body sink completely into your mattress. Feel the weight of your blankets, the softness of your pillow. You're safe. You're warm. You're held. The stories you've heard tonight are tragic, but they're also stories of resilience, of families who continue to hope and fight and advocate. They're stories of communities that remember. They're stories of investigators who refuse to give up. They're stories that matter, that teach us, that move us toward being better, more compassionate, more committed to justice. And now they're part of you. Part of your understanding of the world, of the challenges we face, of the work that still needs to be done. You'll carry them with you. These 5 stories, these 5 lives. Not as burdens, but as reminders. Reminders to be aware, to be compassionate, to value life, to work for justice. Let sleep come fully now. Let the darkness be peaceful and gentle. Let your mind quiet and rest. The stories are told. The night is deep. And you, having listened with an open heart, deserve peace and rest. Tomorrow, if you want to, you can learn more about these cases. You can look up the names we've discussed tonight. You can see if there are updates, if new information has emerged, if the cases have progressed. You can support organizations that help families of missing persons. You can share these stories with others who might care, who might have information, who might be moved to help. But tonight, right now, your only job is to rest. To let your body and mind recover from the emotional work of listening to these difficult stories. To take care of yourself so that tomorrow you can take care of others, can engage with the world, can contribute to making it safer and more just. Sleep is healing. Sleep is necessary. Sleep is a gift you're giving yourself after hours of bearing witness to tragedy. Accept that gift. Let yourself drift into the gentle darkness of sleep. The rain sounds continue their steady rhythm in the background. Let them wash over you, washing away tension, washing away the heaviness, leaving you clean and peaceful and ready for rest. 5 young women walked into ordinary days and never came back. Their families have waited decades for answers. Their cases remain open, their stories unfinished. But tonight, you've honored them by listening. You've held space for their memory. You've cared. And that caring is not nothing. It's something real and meaningful and good. Let that be enough for tonight. Let yourself be satisfied with the simple act of having listened, having cared, having remembered. You don't have to solve these cases. You don't have to carry the weight of these tragedies alone. You just have to remember, to care, to be human in your compassion. And you've done that. Beautifully, fully, with an open heart. So sleep now, my friend. Sleep knowing you've honored 5 lives tonight. Sleep knowing you've done something meaningful. Sleep knowing that your compassion and attention matter. The night holds you gently. The darkness is peaceful. Your bed supports you completely. And sleep, sweet sleep, is waiting to receive you. Lynn, Eileen, Judy, Cheryl. 5 names. 5 lives. 5 stories that will stay with you, gently, honorably, in the quiet corners of your memory. Rest well. You've earned it. You've listened with care and compassion, and that's a generous, important thing. Good night. But before you drift away completely, before sleep takes you entirely, let me leave you with some final thoughts. Some reflections on what these stories mean, not just individually but collectively. Not just historically, but in our present moment. The 1970s were 50 years ago now. Half a century. An entire lifetime has passed since Lynn Schulz disappeared from Middlebury College. Children who weren't born when these disappearances occurred are now grandparents themselves. The world has changed in ways that would be unrecognizable to these 5 young women if they could see it. And yet, the fundamental vulnerabilities they experience still exist. Young women are still at risk. People still disappear. Families still wait for answers that may never come. The specific circumstances have changed, the technology is different, the systems are better in some ways. But the core reality, that violence exists and that it often goes unpunished, remains. This is both discouraging and motivating. Discouraging because it reminds us how far we still have to go, how much work remains to be done. Motivating because it shows us clearly where that work needs to happen, what challenges still need to be addressed. We've made progress. Real, measurable progress. DNA technology has solved cases that would have been impossible to solve in the 70s. Amber Alerts have saved lives. Better databases have connected crimes across jurisdictions. Improved training has made investigations more effective. These advances are real and important. But we can't be satisfied with progress alone. We have to continue pushing, continue improving, continue working toward a world where fewer people experience what these 5 young women and their families experienced. This means continued investment in forensic technology. It means better resources for cold case units. It means improved training for law enforcement on how to handle missing persons cases. It means better support for families dealing with the trauma of having a loved one disappear. It also means cultural change. It means taking violence against women seriously from the very beginning. It means believing victims and potential victims when they report feeling unsafe. It means creating communities where people look out for each other, where absence is noticed quickly, where everyone feels responsible for everyone else's safety. These are big goals, requiring sustained effort from many people over long periods of time. But they're achievable. We've already made significant progress. We can continue that progress if we commit to it, if we refuse to become complacent, if we keep the needs of victims and their families at the center of our efforts. For the families of Lynn, Eileen, Judy Sylvester, Judy Martins, and Cheryl, this progress comes too late. Their loved ones disappeared in an era when the tools to find them or solve their cases didn't exist. And now, even with all our advances, the cases remain cold because the critical evidence was never collected or has degraded beyond usefulness. This is the tragedy of being on the wrong side of historical change. These 5 young women and their families didn't benefit from the progress their cases helped inspire. They were the examples that taught us we needed to do better, but they didn't get the protection of that better system. All we can do now is honor their memory by continuing the work of improvement, by ensuring that future victims have better chances of being found, of getting justice, of having their cases solved, by supporting current families of missing persons with the resources and compassion they need. This is how we honor the past while working toward a better future. We remember what was lost. We learn from what went wrong. We commit to doing better going forward. And we never, ever forget the human beings at the center of these stories. Not the theories or the mysteries or the investigative failures, but the people. The 5 young women who lived and who deserved so much more than what happened to them. Let your eyes close completely now if they haven't already. Let your body be still and heavy and relaxed. We're in the final moments of our time together tonight. I want to thank you for staying with these stories through all these hours, for caring enough to listen, for honoring these 5 lives with your attention and compassion. That's not a small thing. In a world that often moves too quickly, that often forgets too easily, that sometimes treats tragedies as mere entertainment, you've chosen to slow down, to remember, to care deeply. That choice matters. It contributes to a culture that values victims, that refuses to forget unsolved cases, that works toward justice even when justice seems impossible. Your individual act of listening and caring joins with countless other individual acts to create collective movement toward a better, safer, more just world. So thank you. Thank you for caring about Lynn and Eileen and Judy and Cheryl. Thank you for holding space for their families' ongoing grief. Thank you for bearing witness to these difficult stories. If you're still awake, if sleep hasn't quite taken you yet, I have a small request. If you found value in these stories tonight, if you feel that this time was meaningful, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your subscription helps ensure that more stories like these can be told, that more victims can be remembered, that more families can have their loved ones' cases kept alive in public consciousness. And if you feel comfortable doing so, please leave a comment letting us know you were here, that you listened, that you cared. Tell us where you're from, what time it is where you are as you listen to this. These comments create community, connect people who care about these issues, and remind families of missing persons that they're not alone in remembering and caring about their loved ones. These small acts, subscribing and commenting, they matter. They support this work. They build community. They keep these stories alive. But whether you subscribe or comment or not, whether you engage in those ways or simply carry these stories quietly in your memory, you've done something meaningful tonight. You've honored 5 lives. You've borne witness. You've cared. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Now, finally, truly, it's time to sleep. Let the weight of these stories settle into a peaceful place in your memory. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but also not overwhelming. Held gently, with respect and compassion, honored by your attention but not dominating your rest. Lynn Scholes. Remember her name as you drift toward sleep. She was 18. She was real. She mattered. Eileen Henson. 19 years old. She packed a suitcase for a trip she never took. She mattered. Judy Sylvester. 24. 5 feet tall. Wearing a handmade necklace. She mattered. Judy Martins. A student advisor. 300 yards from safety. She mattered. Cheryl and Scherer. 19. Working at a gas station. Taken in daylight. She mattered. They all mattered. They all still matter. And you, by listening tonight, have ensured they're remembered, honored, valued. Sleep well, my friend. You've done good work tonight. You've carried heavy stories with grace and compassion. You've honored lives that deserved better. You've cared deeply about people you never knew, but who are worthy of that care. The night is deep and quiet now. The rain continues its gentle rhythm. Your breath is slow and steady. Your body is completely relaxed. And sleep, sweet, merciful sleep, is ready to receive you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Until next time, rest peacefully, dream gently, and remember that even in the darkness of unsolved mysteries and ongoing grief, there is still light, still hope, still the possibility of answers and justice and peace. Good night. Sleep well. And may you wake tomorrow with compassion in your heart and commitment to making the world a little safer, a little more just, a little more caring. 5 girls who disappeared in the 1970s. 5 families who still wait. 5 stories that matter. And you, who listened to every word, who cared about every detail, who honored every life. Thank you. Good night.